The train station platform was empty except for one woman clutching a worn carpet bag and the dreams she'd carried across 3 territories. Nora Whitman stood frozen as the last wagon disappeared into Wyoming dust, abandoning her for the 3rd time in 18 months. Another mail-order arrangement. Another man who'd taken one look at her mixed heritage face and vanished. The ticketmaster's pitying stare said what his silence wouldn't. Some women just aren't meant to be chosen. As twilight swallowed the prairie and cold bit through her thin shawl, Nora faced a truth sharper than winter wind. Maybe everyone had been right about her all along. If you want to know how a woman left with nothing finds everything she never knew she needed, stay until the very end. And please, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The evening shadows stretched long across the weathered planks of Bitter Creek Station, turning the wood the color of old bruises. Nora Whitman had watched those shadows creep toward her boots for the better part of 2 hours now, each inch of darkness a confirmation of what she'd known, what she'd feared, from the moment she'd stepped off the afternoon train. He wasn't coming. The realization sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and familiar. Thomas Garrett, the rancher who'd promised her a fresh start in his letters, who'd written about the Wyoming territory like it was a promised land where the past didn't matter. He'd taken one look at her through the station house window and made his choice. She'd seen the exact moment, the way his eyes had moved from her travel-worn dress to her face, taking in the copper tones of her skin, the straight black fall of her hair barely contained beneath her bonnet, the features that marked her as neither one thing nor another in a world that demanded you be something definite. His expression had shifted from anticipation to confusion to something harder. Then he'd simply turned on his heel and walked away, his boots echoing on the platform until even that sound had abandoned her. It wasn't the first time. Nora lowered herself onto the station's single bench, her carpet bag settling beside her with a soft thump that sounded too much like defeat. The bag held everything she owned: 2 calico dresses, 1 Sunday dress that had belonged to her mother, a few undergarments mended so many times they were more thread than fabric, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, and a small leather pouch containing $4.63. $4.63 between her and destitution. The ticketmaster, a balding man with sympathetic eyes that somehow made everything worse, appeared in the doorway. "Miss, we'll be closing up soon. There's a boarding house 3 streets over, Mrs. Henderson's place. She's decent folk, won't turn you away if you've got coin for a night." Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. Decent folk. The phrase always came with qualifications, didn't it? Decent folk who'd give her a room but wouldn't sit with her at meals? Decent folk who'd accept her money but warn their daughters not to talk to her? Decent folk who'd let her stay as long as she kept her head down and didn't remind them too much of what she was. What she was. The eternal question that had followed her since childhood, when her mother, full Cherokee, had died of fever, and her father, Irish to his bones, had deposited 8-year-old Nora at a missionary school and never returned. The missionaries had called her a soul to be saved. The other children had called her other things. The families who'd taken her in for a season or 2 before finding reasons to send her back, they'd simply called her temporary. Everything in Nora's life had been temporary. She'd survived, the way dandelions survive in sidewalk cracks, finding sustenance where none seemed to exist. By 16, she'd been working in a St. Louis boarding house, invisible in her utility. By 20, she'd convinced herself that marriage might offer something more permanent than the rotating rooms and suspicious glances that had defined her existence. That's when she'd answered her first mail-order advertisement. Henry Morrison in Kansas had seemed promising in his letters, a shopkeeper in need of a wife to help run his store and provide companionship in these lonely plains. His letters had been pragmatic rather than romantic, which Nora had appreciated. She'd saved every penny for months to afford the train fare, arrived in Wichita with hope still intact, and watched it crumble when Henry had taken one look at her and stammered that there must have been some misunderstanding. His mother, materializing behind him like a vengeful spirit, had made it clear what the misunderstanding was. "We're respectable people," the old woman had hissed, as if Nora's very presence was an accusation. The second attempt in Colorado had been worse. James Thatcher hadn't even bothered with excuses. He'd simply looked her up and down, said no, and walked away, leaving her standing in the Denver depot with her carpetbag and her shredded dignity. And now Thomas Garrett had completed the trinity of rejection. The ticketmaster coughed politely. "Miss, it's past 7. I've got to lock up." "Of course." Nora stood, ignoring the way her legs had stiffened from sitting. "Thank you for your kindness." She meant it. He hadn't had to wait as long as he hadn't had to suggest the boarding house. Small mercies were still mercies, even when they came wrapped in pity. The November wind hit her the moment she stepped outside, cutting through her shawl like it was made of paper. Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory was aptly named. The town sprawled along the rail line in a haphazard collection of false-fronted buildings that looked like they might blow away if the wind changed direction. She could see the boarding house the ticketmaster had mentioned, a 2-story structure with peeling yellow paint and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Mrs. Henderson's Respectable Rooms." Respectable. That word again. Nora calculated quickly. If the room cost 50 cents, and it likely would, and breakfast another quarter, she'd have less than $4 by morning. Enough for maybe a week if she was careful, if she could find work. If. The word that had governed her entire life. She was halfway to the boarding house when she heard the voice. "Well now, look what the train dragged in." 3 men stood outside what appeared to be a saloon, though the darkness made it hard to see clearly. The one who'd spoken was tall, with a beard that obscured most of his face. His companions laughed at his comment, the sound sharp in the cold air. Nora kept walking, her carpetbag clutched tight, eyes forward. The first rule of survival: don't engage, don't respond, don't give them a reason. "Where you headed, sweetheart? Need some company?" This from one of the others, younger, with liquor slurring his words. "Pretty thing like you shouldn't be out alone after dark." The first man again, his boots scraping on wood as he stepped off the saloon's porch. Nora's heart kicked against her ribs, but she maintained her pace. The boarding house was just ahead. 40 feet. 30. The warm glow of lamps visible in the windows promised safety, civilization, witness. "I'm talking to you. Evening, gentlemen." A woman's voice, crisp and carrying clear authority. "Don't you have homes to get to?" The men stopped. Nora risked a glance back and saw a figure silhouetted in the doorway of a dress shop, based on the headless mannequin visible in the window. The woman was older, gray hair pinned in a severe bun, her posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from years of refusing to tolerate nonsense. "Just being friendly, Mrs. Patterson," the bearded man muttered. "Friendly's done for the evening. Go on now." The men shuffled off, their bravado deflating like punctured balloons. The woman, Mrs. Patterson, turned her attention to Nora. For a moment, Nora prepared herself for another assessment, another judgment. But Mrs. Patterson simply nodded once, sharp and businesslike, before retreating into her shop and closing the door. Another small mercy. Nora reached Mrs. Henderson's boarding house with her heart still racing. The porch steps creaked under her weight, and the front door opened before she could knock. "You must be the girl from the train." Mrs. Henderson was round-faced and pink-cheeked, with flour dusting her apron and curiosity bright in her eyes. "Ticketmaster sent his boy over, said you'd be needing a room." "Yes, ma'am, if you have one available." "Got 2, actually, 50 cents a night, breakfast included. Lunch and dinner are extra if you want them. House rules are simple. No men above the first floor, no loud noise after 9, and rent's due each morning." Her eyes swept over Nora, a quick but thorough evaluation. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. "Well, come on in then. No sense heating the whole territory." The interior of the boarding house was warm and smelled of baking bread, which made Nora's empty stomach clench painfully. She'd eaten the last of her traveling food, a biscuit and some dried apple. "Tatses so 6 hours ago, Mrs." Henderson led her up a narrow staircase to a small room at the back of the second floor. "Not much, but it's clean," Mrs. Henderson said, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. The room flickered into view. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped pitcher and basin, a single wooden chair, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. A small window looked out over what appeared to be a vegetable garden, though in the darkness it was hard to tell. "It's perfect," Nora said quietly. "Thank you." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. Bathrooms down the hall, shared with the other rooms. There's a young school teacher in the next room, Miss Pruitt, very quiet. And a traveling salesman has the front room, but he's only here Thursdays through Saturdays. She paused. You're the one waiting for Tom Garrett, aren't you? The words hung in the air between them. Nora considered lying, but what was the point? Small towns had big ears. Everyone would know by tomorrow anyway. I was, Nora said carefully. It seems there was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Henderson's sound was non-committal, but her eyes held something that might have been sympathy, or might have been contempt. Nora had long since stopped being able to distinguish between the two. Well, 50 cents then, for tonight. Nora counted out the coins from her leather pouch, each one dropping into Mrs. Henderson's palm like a small piece of her security, vanishing. Mrs. Henderson pocketed them, nodded once more, and left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Finally alone, Nora set her carpetbag on the chair and sank onto the bed. The quilt was worn but clean, as promised, and the mattress was lumpy but better than the train station bench would have been. Outside, the wind rattled the window in its frame, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She should cry. That's what women did in novels, wasn't it? Abandoned, alone, almost penniless. This was the moment for tears, for giving in to despair. But Nora's tears had dried up somewhere between Kansas and Colorado, between the missionary school and the endless string of temporary homes. What was left inside her wasn't soft enough for crying. What was left was something harder, something that had kept her alive this long. She stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. The water was cold, but she splashed it on her face anyway, washing away the train grime and the day's humiliation. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand was shadowy in the lamplight, but she could see enough. The same face that had been there yesterday, the same face that would be there tomorrow, the face that kept making men change their minds. Nora had spent years trying to understand what was so wrong with her. Was it her copper skin? The angle of her cheekbones? The way her hair refused to curl like the fashion magazine said it should? Or was it something deeper, something broken inside her that people could sense the way animals sense storms coming? Her mother had been beautiful. Nora remembered that much, though the memories were fading like old photographs. Beautiful and proud, with her Cherokee heritage worn like armor. She'd taught Nora the old stories, the ones about the first fire and the origin of the Milky Way, about Selu the Corn Mother and the importance of gratitude. She'd taught her to make medicine from plants, to read the weather in the way birds flew, to find strength in the land itself. Then she died, and Nora's father, unable to cope with grief or with a daughter who reminded him of everything he'd lost, had given her away like an unwanted puppy. The missionaries had tried to beat the Cherokee out of her. Not physically, they'd been too enlightened for that, but spiritually, culturally, systematically. They'd forbidden her from speaking what little Tsalagi she'd known, had punished her for mentioning her mother's stories, had made it clear that salvation meant erasure. But they'd failed, because you couldn't beat out what was in the blood, what was in the bones. Nora might not remember all the words, might not know all the stories, but she remembered the feeling of them, the shape they made in her mother's voice, the way they connected her to something larger than herself. Though tonight, that connection felt awfully thin. A knock on the door startled her. Yes? It's Mrs. Henderson. I brought you some supper. Figured you hadn't eaten. Nora opened the door to find the landlady holding a small tray with a bowl of stew, a thick slice of bread, and a cup of tea. The kindness of it, the unexpected, uncomplicated kindness, nearly undid her in a way the rejection hadn't. I didn't pay for meals, Nora managed. No charge. Had extra, and it'd just go to waste. Mrs. Henderson thrust the tray forward, not quite meeting Nora's eyes. Besides, you look like you could use it. Eat up, get some rest. Things might look different in the morning. She was gone before Nora could thank her properly, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. Nora carried the tray to the bed and ate slowly, savoring every bite of the simple stew, potatoes, carrots, onions, some kind of meat. The bread was fresh and still warm. The tea was strong and sweetened with honey. It was the best meal she'd had in months. When she finished, she set the tray outside her door and prepared for bed, stripping down to her chemise and washing as best she could with the cold water. The bed, when she finally climbed into it, was harder than she'd expected, but warmer than it had any right to be. Mrs. Henderson must have put heated bricks in it earlier, another small kindness that made Nora's chest ache. She blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the boarding house settle around her. Footsteps in the hallway, the murmur of voices downstairs, the endless Wyoming wind singing its lonely song against the window pane. Tomorrow, she'd have to figure out what came next. Find work, stretch her remaining money, maybe save enough to move on to the next town, the next territory, the next chance that would inevitably crumble like all the others. The pattern was familiar by now, the cycle of hope and disappointment as predictable as seasons. But tonight, she had a bed. She had a full stomach. She had a locked door between her and the world. Tonight, she was safe. It would have to be enough. Nora closed her eyes and waited for sleep, trying not to think about the men at the station, trying not to replay the moment when Thomas Garrett had looked at her and chosen to walk away, trying not to add up the limited days her money would buy her before she'd have to make harder choices. In the missionary school, they'd taught her that pride was a sin. But pride was all Nora had left, and she'd be damned if she'd give that up too. She'd survived 23 years of rejection, abandonment, and casual cruelty. She'd survived this. She always did. Though for the first time in a long while, Nora found herself wondering if survival was really enough. If there might be something more than just enduring, just lasting, just making it through one more day. Her mother's people had stories about transformation, about people who walked into the forest broken and emerged remade, about trials that stripped you down to nothing so you could be rebuilt stronger. Maybe this was Nora's trial. Maybe Wyoming Territory was her forest. Or maybe it was just another place that would prove what everyone had always suspected, that Nora Whitman was meant to be temporary, floating through life like milkweed on the wind, never taking root, never belonging. The thought followed her down into restless sleep, where she dreamed of train stations and endless platforms, of doors closing in her face and roads that led nowhere. She dreamed of her mother's face, already fading to a beloved blur, and her father's back as he walked away. She dreamed of letters promising fresh starts, and men who couldn't quite look her in the eye. And somewhere in the depths of that troubled sleep, in the space between one breath and the next, she dreamed of a child's hand reaching for hers, small and warm and impossibly trusting. But that part, when she woke to gray morning light filtering through the thin curtains, she wouldn't remember. Not yet. The morning came cold and merciless, with frost painting the inside of the window in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't such clear evidence of how bitter the night had been. Nora woke disoriented, the unfamiliar room taking a moment to resolve into sense. Then memory flooded back, heavy and complete, and she closed her eyes against it for just a moment more. Then she rose, because staying in bed wouldn't change anything, and Nora had learned long ago that the world didn't care about your pain. It just kept moving, indifferent and relentless, and you either moved with it or got trampled. She dressed quickly in the cold room, choosing her better calico dress, the blue one with white flowers that was only mended at the hem, where it didn't show. She brushed and rebraided her hair, pinning it up in a simple style that wouldn't draw attention. In the mirror, she looked presentable. Respectable, even. It wouldn't be enough. It never was. But it was what she had. Downstairs, the smell of coffee and frying bacon led her to a small dining room where Mrs. Henderson was setting out breakfast. Two other boarders were already seated, a prim young woman who must be Miss Pruitt, the schoolteacher, and a portly middle-aged man reading a newspaper. "Good morning," Nora said quietly, taking a seat at the end of the table. Miss Pruitt offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The man grunted without looking up from his paper. Mrs. Henderson bustled in with a plate of eggs and bacon, setting it in front of Nora with slightly more force than necessary. "Eat up," she said. "Going to be a cold one today." The meal was eaten in near silence, broken only by the rustle of the newspaper and the clink of silverware on plates. Nora ate mechanically, fueling her body for whatever this day would demand of her. She was washing down the last of her eggs with bitter coffee when a child's voice floated in from the hallway. "Mrs. Henderson? Is breakfast ready yet? Papa says I need to eat quick because we have shopping to do, and then he has business, and I have to be good and not wander off, But I'm really hungry and I can smell bacon and Lucy Hale, take a breath before you pass out, Mrs. Henderson called, but her voice held affection. Come on in, child, I've got a plate ready for you. The girl who bounced into the dining room was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, all energy and wild honey-colored hair that hadn't been properly brushed. Her dress was clean but rumpled, and her boots were on the wrong feet. She had the kind of face that would be pretty once she grew into it, with wide hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Those eyes landed on Nora and stopped, curious and utterly without judgment. Hello, Lucy said, sliding into the chair across from Nora. I haven't seen you before. Are you new? We're not new anymore. We've been here 6 whole months, but Papa says that's still pretty new for around here because some people have been here for years. Mrs. Henderson, can I have extra bacon today? 1 piece, same as always. Mrs. Henderson set a plate in front of the child. And where's your father? Thought he was right behind you. He's talking to Mr. Chen about something boring. Numbers, probably. Papa's always talking about numbers. Lucy picked up her bacon with her fingers, noticed Miss Pruitt's disapproving look, and made an exaggerated show of using her fork instead. I'm Lucy. What's your name? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Nora found herself answering before she thought better of it. Nora Whitman. That's a pretty name. Nora. Lucy tested it out, bouncing slightly in her chair. You look sad. Are you sad? Mrs. Henderson, why does Miss Nora look sad? Lucy Hale. That's not a polite question, but Mrs. Henderson's tone was gentle, and she shot Nora an apologetic look. Papa says I'm not supposed to notice when people are sad because it makes them uncomfortable, but how can I help if I don't notice? Lucy's logic was unassailable in the way only a child's could be. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table despite Miss Pruitt's audible sniff. Did something bad happen? Nora should have deflected, should have smiled and changed the subject. But there was something about Lucy's directness, her uncomplicated concern, that slipped past Nora's defenses. Something disappointing happened, Nora said carefully. But I'm all right. Disappointment is just sadness wearing a grown-up word, Lucy announced, a bit of egg falling from her fork back onto her plate. Papa says that when he thinks I'm not listening, but I always listen. He's disappointed a lot too. We could be disappointed together, except I think being friends is better than being disappointed, don't you? Lucy, a man's voice from the doorway, warm but weary. Are you bothering the guests again? I'm not bothering, I'm making friends. There's a difference, Papa. The man who entered the dining room was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He wore working clothes, canvas trousers, a worn shirt, boots that had seen hard use, but carried himself with a kind of quiet dignity that had nothing to do with clothing. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 older, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it didn't look so tired. I apologize for my daughter, he said, his eyes finding Nora's. She doesn't always understand boundaries. I understand boundaries, Lucy protested. I just think they're silly sometimes. That's the definition of not understanding them, sweetheart. He moved to the table, resting a hand on Lucy's shoulder. Finish your breakfast? We've got a lot to do today. But his eyes stayed on Nora for a moment longer than necessary, a question forming in them. Not judgment, she realized with surprise. Just curiosity, and maybe recognition, the kind that came from understanding what it looked like when someone was barely holding themselves together. She looked away first, focusing on the last of her coffee. When she glanced back up, he'd turned his attention to his daughter, who was chattering about something she'd seen in the general store window. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, in the gentle way he brushed Lucy's tangled hair back from her face, that made Nora's chest ache with a loneliness she'd been successfully ignoring for months. This was what she'd been trying to find in those mail-order arrangements. Not romance, not even necessarily love. Just this. Belonging. Connection. The simple right to exist in someone's space without apology. But that right wasn't hers. It had never been hers. Nora finished her coffee, excused herself quietly, and retreated upstairs to her room. She had 50 cents left to her name, and the day spreading out ahead of her like a judgment. She needed work, needed a plan, needed to figure out how to survive in this cold Wyoming town that had already rejected her before she'd fully arrived. Through the thin walls, she could hear Lucy's voice still chattering downstairs, bright and relentless as morning sun. Something about the sound made Nora's throat tight, though she couldn't have said why. Some people were meant to be temporary, but maybe, just maybe, temporary was long enough to matter. Nora stood at her window watching Bitter Creek come alive in the pale morning light. Shopkeepers swept their porches, wagons rolled past carrying supplies, and children darted between buildings on their way to the schoolhouse at the edge of town. Life moved forward with practiced rhythm, indifferent to her presence or absence. She'd seen a dozen towns like this, each one blurring into the next until they became interchangeable backdrops to her ongoing displacement. She needed to find work today. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. At 50 cents per night, her remaining money would last 8 days, maybe 10 if she skipped meals. After that, she'd be out on the street with nothing but her carpet bag and whatever remained of her dignity. The knock on her door came soft but insistent. "Miss Whitman, you in there?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a note Nora couldn't quite identify. She opened the door to find the landlady holding a folded newspaper, her expression somewhere between uncomfortable and determined. "There's a notice here you might want to see," Mrs. Henderson said, thrusting the paper forward. "Mrs. Patterson at the dress shop is looking for help. Says so right here in the advertisements. She's particular about who she hires, but after what she did last night, well, I figure she saw something in you worth defending." Nora took the paper, her eyes finding the small advertisement. "Seamstress wanted. Must have steady hands and disposition. Inquire at Patterson's Fine Dresses." The notice was 2 weeks old, the paper already yellowing at the edges. "I can't sew," Nora admitted quietly. "Can you learn?" The question hung between them. Could she learn? She'd learned everything else life had demanded of her, how to make herself small, how to read disapproval in the cant of someone's head, how to pack a life into a single bag and move on before anyone could tell her to leave. Surely she could learn to push a needle through fabric. "Yes," Nora said, because what other answer was there? "I can learn." Mrs. Henderson nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Mrs. Patterson opens at 9. You go on over there and tell her I sent you. Tell her Mary Henderson vouched for your character, and Mary Henderson doesn't vouch lightly." "Why are you helping me?" The question escaped before Nora could stop it. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened, lines deepening around her eyes and mouth, the geography of a life lived through hard seasons. "Because 30 years ago, I was a girl alone in a strange town with nothing but lint in my pockets and fear in my belly," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "Someone helped me then. Maybe you'll help someone else when your turn comes." She paused at the doorway. "Besides, Tom Garrett's a fool. Any man who judges a woman by her blood rather than her backbone isn't worth the air he breathes." She was gone before Nora could respond, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Nora looked at the newspaper again, at the small advertisement that might mean the difference between survival and destitution. Hope was a dangerous thing. She'd learned that lesson thoroughly, but sometimes hope was all you had to work with. She changed into her Sunday dress, the one that had been her mother's. It was outdated by at least 5 years, but the fabric was still good, a deep green wool that brought out the warmth in her skin. Her mother had worn it to trading posts, to meetings with Indian agents, to every occasion that demanded she be seen and taken seriously. Nora brushed the dress carefully, as if the action could transfer some of her mother's strength into her own trembling hands. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, Lucy Hale was back in the dining room, this time with a slate and chalk, practicing letters with the fierce concentration only children could muster. Her father sat beside her, patient but visibly distracted, one hand on his daughter's shoulder while his eyes remained fixed on some distant concern. "That's a B, Papa. See? B for bird and butter, and—" Lucy looked up and spotted Nora, her face transformed with delight. "Miss Nora, are you going somewhere fancy? You look really pretty." "Lucy," her father said wearily. "What?" "She does look pretty. I'm just saying true things. Mrs. Henderson says always tell the truth unless it's going to hurt someone's feelings, and saying someone looks pretty can't hurt feelings because it's a nice thing." Lucy's logic tumbled out in a rush. "Are you going somewhere fancy?" "I'm going to look for work," Nora said, surprised to find herself answering. "Oh." Lucy considered this. "What kind of work? Can you teach?" Miss Pruitt teaches, but she's very serious and doesn't smile much. Or can you cook? Mrs. Henderson cooks, but she says she's getting too old for all the bending. Or can you... Lucy, breathe. Her father's voice held exhausted affection. He looked at Nora with an expression that might have been apology. I'm sorry, she hasn't quite learned that not every thought needs to be spoken aloud. I'm practicing conversation, Lucy announced. You said I needed to practice. I said you needed to practice appropriate conversation. How do I know what's appropriate if I don't practice all the kinds? Nora found herself smiling despite everything. There was something relentlessly honest about Lucy, something that refused to acknowledge the unspoken rules that governed adult interaction. In Lucy's world, if you thought someone looked pretty, you said so. If you were curious, you asked. If you wanted to be friends, you declared it. It must be exhausting for her father. As if reading her thoughts, the man stood and extended his hand. Evan Hale. And you've already met my daughter, who apparently has opinions about everyone in town. His handshake was firm and brief, his palm calloused in a way that spoke of manual labor. Up close, Nora could see the weariness that lived in his face, not just sleeplessness but grief, old and settled like sediment at the bottom of a river. Nora Whitman, she said, and your daughter's not wrong to have opinions, shows she's paying attention. She pays too much attention to some things and not enough to others. But his hand had returned to Lucy's shoulder, the gesture unconsciously protective. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you'd just arrived. Are you planning to stay in Bitter Creek? The question was casual, but Nora heard the real inquiry beneath it. Are you another temporary soul passing through, or someone who might actually put down roots? That depends on whether I can find work, Nora said honestly. I'm on my way to Patterson's dress shop now. Mrs. Patterson's tough but fair, Evan said. And if she hires you, she'll defend you against anyone who gives you trouble. She's got a backbone like iron and a tongue that could strip paint. Papa says Mrs. Patterson is formidable, Lucy added helpfully. That means scary, but in a good way. That's not quite what formidable means, sweetheart. Close enough, though, right? Evan sighed, but affection flickered across his tired features. He looked at Nora again, and for a moment something passed between them. Recognition, maybe? Or just the acknowledgement that they were both people doing their best in a world that demanded more than best often provided. Good luck, he said simply. I hope Mrs. Patterson sees what we do. The words followed Nora out of the boarding house and down the street, warming her against the November cold. What we do. As if he saw something in her worth seeing, as if Lucy's unfiltered declaration of her prettiness came from genuine observation rather than childish prattle. Patterson's fine dresses occupied a narrow storefront between the general store and a law office. The window display featured a headless mannequin wearing a burgundy traveling suit that would have cost Nora 6 months' wages at the boarding house where she'd worked in St. Louis. Through the glass, she could see bolts of fabric arranged by color, a sewing machine gleaming in the morning light, and Mrs. Patterson herself, gray head bent over work at a large cutting table. Nora pushed through the door, a small bell announcing her arrival. Mrs. Patterson looked up, her sharp eyes taking in everything about Nora in one comprehensive sweep, the outdated dress worn with care, the hands clasped too tightly, the spine held straight through sheer force of will. Recognition flickered across her face. You're the girl from last night, Mrs. Patterson said. Not a question. The one those drunken fools were bothering. Yes, ma'am, and you're the woman who helped me. I wanted to thank you. No need. I don't tolerate that behavior on my street. Mrs. Patterson set down her scissors with precision. What brings you here this morning? If you're looking for work, I should tell you up front that I have high standards. I don't hire girls who'll show up late, work sloppy, or bring drama through my door. Mrs. Henderson sent me. She said you were looking for a seamstress. Nora forced herself to maintain eye contact. I should be honest. I don't know how to sew, but I learned quickly. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I won't bring you any trouble. Can't sew? Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. Then what makes you think you can work in a dress shop? Because I need to, Nora said simply. And because when I need to do something, I find a way to do it. I can learn stitching. I can learn patterns. I can learn whatever you need me to learn, and I'll work harder than anyone you could hire who already knows how. The silence stretched between them, taut as thread. Mrs. Patterson's expression revealed nothing, but her eyes continued their assessment, measuring something beyond just Nora's words. "You're the mail-order bride Tom Garrett rejected," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "The whole town's talking about it. He's telling anyone who'll listen that there was a misunderstanding, but we all know what that means. Took one look at you and got cold feet because you're not white enough for his taste." The words landed like slaps, each one stripping away pretense. Nora felt her face heat, but she didn't look away. "Yes, ma'am. And now you're stranded here with probably no money and nowhere to go, so you're desperate enough to beg for work you're not qualified for." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson drummed her fingers on the cutting table, a rhythmic tap that seemed to measure time against possibility. Finally, she sighed. "I'll give you a trial," she said. "1 week, no pay. You show up every morning at 8 sharp, you do exactly what I tell you, you don't complain, and you don't quit. At the end of the week, if you've learned enough to be useful, I'll hire you proper at $3 a week plus board." $3 a week. It wasn't much, but it was survival. It was hope measured in coins. "Plus board?" Nora repeated. "There's a room above the shop, nothing fancy. You'd have it to yourself and you wouldn't have to pay Mrs. Henderson for lodging. Before you get excited, understand that I'm not offering this out of charity. I'm old, my eyes aren't what they used to be, and I've got more orders than I can handle alone. I need help. Whether you turn out to be that help remains to be seen." "I'll prove it," Nora said, her voice steady despite the hope threatening to choke her. "I won't let you down." "See that you don't. Now take off that dress, carefully, it's well made even if it's old, and put on that work apron hanging by the door. We're going to start with the absolute basics, and I warn you, I'm not a patient teacher." The morning dissolved into an education more grueling than anything the missionary school had offered. Mrs. Patterson proved true to her word about patience. She had none. But beneath the sharp corrections and exasperated sighs lived something else, a determination to teach, to pass on knowledge earned through decades of pricked fingers and ruined fabric. Nora learned to thread a needle, to make a basic running stitch, to understand the difference between selvage and bias. Her fingers felt clumsy and thick, the needle slippery in her grasp. She pricked herself so many times that blood spotted the practice fabric, each drop a small failure that made her jaw tighten with determination. "Don't clutch the fabric like you're trying to strangle it," Mrs. Patterson said for the 10th time. "Gentle but firm, like holding a baby bird, secure but not crushing." Nora had never held a baby bird, but she adjusted her grip anyway, trying to find that balance between too much and too little. The stitches that emerged were uneven and crooked, but they held. That was something. By noon, her back ached from hunching over the work, and her eyes burned from focusing on the needle's movement. Mrs. Patterson made her stop for lunch, bread and cheese and strong tea that cleared some of the fog from her head. "You're better than I expected," Mrs. Patterson admitted grudgingly. "Worse than I'd hoped, but better than expected. Your hands have potential once they remember they're connected to your brain." It was possibly the finest compliment Nora had received in years. The afternoon brought new challenges: hemming, measuring, understanding how fabric moved and draped. Mrs. Patterson explained the way different materials required different approaches, how silk demanded respect while cotton forgave mistakes. She showed Nora her order book, pages filled with requests from ranch wives and town ladies, each one specific in their requirements. "This is Mrs. Chen's dress," Mrs. Patterson said, indicating a partially completed garment on the dress form. "She's the banker's wife, very particular. The hem needs to be exactly 16 inches from the floor, the waist taken in another ½ inch. Think you can handle measuring and pinning while I work on the bodice?" Nora took the measuring tape with hands that trembled slightly. The responsibility felt enormous. One mistake could ruin days of work. But Mrs. Patterson was watching, waiting, so Nora knelt and began measuring, counting twice to be sure. She was on her third verification when the shop bell rang. Lucy Hale burst through the door like a small, enthusiastic storm, her father following behind with a basket. "Miss Nora, you're here. Papa said you might be here, and I said we should bring you lunch because everyone needs lunch, and Mrs. Henderson made extra sandwiches, and, oh, are you making a dress? That's so pretty. Can I touch it?" "Lucy, no touching," Evan said quickly. He looked at Mrs. Patterson apologetically. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Lucy was convinced Miss Whitman might not have eaten." "She ate," Mrs. Patterson said dryly, but the child's not wrong that she could probably use more. She's been working straight through since this morning. Lucy beamed, vindicated. She thrust the basket at Nora. See? I was right. There's roast beef and pickles and Mrs. Henderson's molasses cookies. And Papa said maybe you'd share the cookies with me, but that's just a suggestion, not a requirement. Lucy, Evan warned. What? I'm being subtle. That's not subtle, sweetheart. That's transparent. Nora found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. Lucy's enthusiasm was like watching sunlight break through clouds, impossible to resist even when you were determined to stay in shadow. She glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who made a shooing motion. Take 15 minutes. Your stitches are getting sloppier anyway, which means your focus is shot. Eat the sandwich, share the cookie, and come back ready to concentrate. Nora sat on the stool by the window, and Lucy immediately claimed the space beside her, pressing close with the easy physicality of childhood. Evan remained standing, looking uncomfortable but making no move to leave. Did you get the job? Lucy asked, watching Nora unwrap the sandwich. Are you going to stay? Please say you're staying because Bitter Creek needs more nice people, and you seem very nice, and also I like you. Lucy, Miss Whitman doesn't need you to narrate her entire life, Evan said. I'm not narrating. I'm asking important questions. Lucy swung her legs, her boots, still on the wrong feet, bumping against the stool. Papa says I ask too many questions, but how else are you supposed to learn things? Mrs. Henderson says curiosity is a virtue, but Papa says it depends on what you're curious about. I'm on trial for a week, Nora told Lucy, because the child's direct questions deserve direct answers. If I do well, Mrs. Patterson will hire me properly. So yes, I'll be staying, at least for now. That's wonderful, Lucy clapped her hands together. Did you hear that, Papa? Miss Nora's staying. That means she can come to supper sometimes, and maybe you could teach her how to fish, and I could show her my favorite spot by the creek where the willows grow, and, sweetheart, I'm sure Miss Whitman has her own plans, Evan interrupted gently, but his eyes met Nora's with something that might have been hope. Though you'd be welcome, for supper, if you wanted. Lucy's right that we don't have enough nice people around, and Mrs. Henderson vouches for you, which counts for a lot. The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Nora wasn't sure how to interpret. Was this simple kindness or something more complicated? Evan Hale didn't look at her the way most men did, with either too much interest or too much disdain. He looked at her like she was simply another person navigating difficult circumstances, which was somehow more disarming than any other response. That's very kind, Nora said carefully, though I should probably focus on learning to sew before I add social obligations. Supper's not an obligation, Lucy protested. It's fun. Well, mostly fun. Sometimes Papa burns things and then it's less fun, but usually Mrs. Chen cooks extra and brings it over because Papa's hopeless in the kitchen and I'm too little to reach the stove and we all have to eat something. Lucy, Evan said, his ears reddening, that's enough. I'm just being honest. You're the one who says honesty is important. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been pretending not to listen while organizing thread spools, made a sound that might have been laughter. The child has a point, Hale. You do burn most things you attempt to cook. Thank you for that, Mrs. Patterson, Evan said with exaggerated dignity. Then to Nora, the invitation stands, no pressure, but Lucy would be delighted, and I promise to serve something edible even if I have to beg Mrs. Chen for mercy. Before Nora could respond, Lucy had wrapped her arms around Nora's waist in an impulsive hug that squeezed the breath from her lungs. The embrace was brief but fierce, carrying all the warmth and uncomplicated affection of childhood. I'm glad you're staying, Lucy whispered against Nora's shoulder. You don't look as sad now. Then she was pulling away, grabbing her father's hand, chattering about needing to stop at the general store for ribbons. Evan let himself be tugged toward the door, but he glanced back once, his expression soft with something Nora couldn't quite name. See you around, Miss Whitman, he said. Then they were gone, the bell's cheerful jingle marking their departure. Nora sat very still, the half-eaten sandwich forgotten in her lap, her arms still feeling the ghost of Lucy's embrace. When was the last time someone had hugged her? When was the last time someone had touched her with simple affection rather than assessment or judgment? That child's starving for a mother, Mrs. Patterson said quietly, breaking the silence. And that man's drowning in grief he won't acknowledge. Lost his wife 2 years ago to fever. Lucy was barely 4, doesn't remember much except the losing part. They moved here from Kansas, trying to outrun the memories, but grief's got a way of following you no matter how far you travel. The words settled over Nora like a familiar cloak. She understood that kind of grief, that kind of running. Maybe that was what she'd seen in Evan's eyes, recognition of a fellow fugitive. He seems like a good father, Nora said. He is, but good doesn't mean easy, and raising a daughter alone would test any man's strength. Lucy needs a woman's touch, needs someone who can teach her things a father can't. Half the women in this town have tried to catch Evan's eye, but he's not interested, too busy surviving to think about living. Mrs. Patterson picked up her scissors again, signaling the end of their break. Finish your sandwich and get back to work. That hem won't measure itself, and I need to see if your hands can maintain precision when you're tired. That's when you learn what someone's really made of. Nora finished eating and returned to the dress form, her muscles protesting the resumed position. But Lucy's hug had left her feeling somehow lighter, as if the child's belief in her goodness might actually make it true. She measured carefully, pinned precisely, and when Mrs. Patterson inspected her work, the older woman nodded with something approaching approval. Adequate, Mrs. Patterson said, which from her seemed equivalent to effusive praise. Now remove those pins and do it again. Twice more, until your hands remember the motion without your brain having to supervise. The afternoon stretched into evening, the light fading until Mrs. Patterson lit the lamps. Other women passed by the shop window. Ranch wives in practical dresses, town ladies in more elaborate garments, all of them glancing in with varying degrees of curiosity. Nora felt their stares like pressure against her skin, knew they were talking about her. The rejected mail-order bride, the mixed-blood woman working in Patterson's shop, the temporary soul who might or might not last the week. Let them talk. Nora had stopped trying to control what people said about her years ago. Words couldn't hurt her anymore. She'd built up too many calluses for that. What could hurt her, she was discovering, were small kindnesses. Mrs. Henderson's vouching, Mrs. Patterson's grudging patience, Lucy's impulsive hug and uncomplicated declaration of friendship, Evan's invitation offered without expectation. These were the things that could crack her carefully constructed armor, let hope seep through the gaps like water finding fissures in stone. And hope was dangerous because it made you vulnerable, made you believe that maybe this time would be different, maybe this place would be different, maybe she could be different. By the time Mrs. Patterson dismissed her for the evening, Nora's fingers ached and her eyes felt like they'd been scrubbed with sand. But she'd completed the hem measurements to Mrs. Patterson's satisfaction and had begun learning basic seam work. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Tomorrow, 8 sharp, Mrs. Patterson reminded her. And bring your things. Might as well move into the upstairs room tonight if you're planning to stay the week. No sense paying Mrs. Henderson for lodging you don't need. Nora walked back to the boarding house through deepening twilight, her mind full of measurements and thread counts, and the memory of Lucy's arms around her waist. Mrs. Henderson was serving supper when she arrived, the dining room warm with the smell of pot roast and lamplight. "Well?" Mrs. Henderson demanded the moment Nora appeared. "Did she hire you?" "Trial period. 1 week, then we'll see." "That's as good as hired with Agnes Patterson. She wouldn't waste a week on you if she didn't think you had potential." Mrs. Henderson ladled stew into a bowl with satisfaction. "Sit down and eat. You look like you've been run over by a threshing machine." Nora ate quickly, her mind already on the task of packing her few belongings. When she went upstairs, she found Lucy's basket sitting outside her door with a note in child's careful printing. "For Miss Nora, because friends share cookies. Love, Lucy." Inside were 3 molasses cookies wrapped in checkered cloth. Nora sat on her bed with the cookies in her lap and felt something dangerous rise in her chest, something warm and terrible and hopeful. She was so tired of hoping. Hope required energy she wasn't sure she possessed anymore. But Lucy Hale's friendship didn't ask for energy. It simply existed, uncomplicated and freely given, expecting nothing in return except maybe the chance to talk endlessly about ribbons and fish and whatever else filled a 7-year-old's boundless imagination. She packed her carpet bag with hands that shook slightly, careful to fold her mother's dress properly. The green wool was the only thing she had left of her mother besides memories that grew hazier with each passing year. Sometimes Nora tried to remember her mother's voice and found only approximations, echoes of echoes. But the dress remained solid, real, proof that her mother had existed, had worn beautiful things, had been someone worth remembering. Mrs. Henderson appeared as Nora was preparing to leave. "So you're off to Patterson's then? Here." She thrust a small bundle into Nora's hands. "Extra blanket. That room above the shop gets cold at night, and Agnes is too stubborn to admit she needs better insulation. Thank you for everything, for vouching for me, for the meals, for doing what any decent person would do," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "Now go on, and remember what I said about helping the next person when your turn comes. That's how kindness works. You pass it along until the whole world's covered in it, or at least until more people have blankets than don't." The room above Patterson's fine dresses was small and plain, with a slanted ceiling that Nora could almost stand upright beneath. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with one chair, and a window that looked out over the main street. Mrs. Patterson showed her where the lamp oil was kept, where to find extra blankets, how to work the temperamental stove in the corner. "Bathrooms in the back of the shop, chamber pots under the bed for night use," Mrs. Patterson said briskly. "No visitors after dark, no loud noise, no trouble. You work hard and keep to yourself, and we'll get along fine." After Mrs. Patterson left, Nora stood in the center of her new room and took inventory. It was smaller than any place she'd ever lived, the ceiling so low she could touch it with her palm. The bed was lumpy, the stove smoked when first lit, and cold air whistled through gaps in the walls. It was perfect. It was hers. For the first time in her 23 years, Nora had a space that belonged to her, that she'd earned through her own determination rather than someone else's charity or tolerance. The knowledge sat in her chest like a coal, small and hot and dangerous. She unpacked her carpetbag slowly, hanging her dresses on the wall pegs, arranging her hairbrush and her mother's few remaining hairpins on the small table. She spread Mrs. Henderson's extra blanket on the bed and placed Lucy's cookies on the windowsill where she could see them catch the morning light. Then she sat on the bed and let herself cry, silently, the tears coming from some deep well she'd kept locked for years. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, or even of relief. They were tears of release, of letting go of the constant vigilance that had defined her existence. Just for this moment, just for tonight, she could stop bracing for the next rejection, the next abandonment, the next proof that she didn't belong. Just for tonight, she could belong to herself. The next morning arrived cold and clear, frost painting the window in delicate fractals. Nora woke before dawn and dressed carefully, her fingers still sore from yesterday's work but steady. She made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Patterson already in the shop, cutting fabric with the precise movements of long practice. "Good. You're early," Mrs. Patterson said without looking up. "Coffee's in the back room, help yourself. Then I want you to practice your running stitch on these scraps until I can't tell where one stitch ends and another begins. Yesterday's work was adequate. Today's needs to be better." The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Nora's hands slowly remembered how to hold a needle without dropping it, how to maintain even tension, how to move the fabric rather than fighting it. Her stitches became smaller, more consistent. Mrs. Patterson's criticisms grew less frequent, which Nora learned to interpret as approval. On the third day, Mrs. Patterson let her work on an actual garment, the hem of a simple house dress for the blacksmith's daughter. Nora's hands trembled as she made the first stitch, aware that any mistake would waste both time and fabric. But the stitches held, neat and even, and when Mrs. Patterson inspected the finished hem, she nodded once. "You'll do," she said simply. Those two words carried more weight than any elaborate praise. Nora felt them settle into her bones, becoming part of her foundation. Lucy visited the shop every afternoon after her lessons with Miss Pruitt, always bringing some small treasure, a smooth stone from the creek, a ribbon that had come loose from her hair, a handful of wildflowers that were somehow still blooming despite the November cold. She'd sit on the stool by the window and chatter while Nora worked, her presence both distraction and comfort. "Papa says I talk too much," Lucy confided on the fourth day, swinging her legs. "But I think maybe I talk just the right amount and everyone else talks too little. Don't you think people should say what they're thinking? Otherwise, how do you know what anyone really means? Sometimes people need to think before they say things, Nora suggested gently, guiding her needle through a seam. But if you think too much, you might talk yourself out of saying true things because you're worried about what other people will think, and then nobody knows the truth and everyone's just pretending all the time. Lucy considered this philosophically. I don't like pretending. It's too much work. From her cutting table, Mrs. Patterson made a sound that might have been agreement. The child has a point. World would be simpler if people said what they meant. World would be chaos, Nora countered, but she was smiling. Maybe chaos is better than lies, Lucy said seriously. Papa says lies are like termites. They eat away at things from the inside until everything collapses. Your papa's a wise man. He's sad, though. Lucy's voice dropped, her usual exuberance dimming. He tries to hide it, but I can tell. Sometimes I hear him at night walking around the house like he's lost something. And sometimes he looks at my mama's picture and gets this look on his face like his heart hurts. Do you think hearts can hurt like when you skin your knee? Except on the inside where you can't put bandages? Nora set down her needle, giving Lucy her full attention. Yes, I think hearts can hurt like that. Sometimes worse, because you can't see the injury to know how to fix it. Can heart hurts get better? Or do they just stay broken forever? The question hung in the air, weighted with a child's need for reassurance and an adult's fear of the answer. Nora thought about her own heart, scarred and calloused from years of careful guarding. Was it broken or just protected? And was there even a difference anymore? I think hearts can heal, Nora said slowly, but they heal slowly and they scar. And sometimes the scars are so deep they become part of who you are. Lucy nodded solemnly, processing this. Then, with the abrupt subject changes that define childhood, she brightened. Papa invited you to supper again on Sunday. He's going to ask Mrs. Chen to cook because he says it's special, and he doesn't want to poison you with his terrible food. Will you come? Please. I'll show you my room and my books, and we can feed the chickens and— Breathe, child, Mrs. Patterson said. You're turning purple. Lucy gasped dramatically. Will you come, though? Say yes. Papa's too shy to ask properly, so I'm asking for him, and he really wants you to come even if he won't say so. Nora glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who was studying a bolt of fabric with exaggerated interest, clearly pretending not to listen. The invitation should have made Nora nervous. Dinner with a widower and his daughter carried implications, created expectations. But Lucy's eager face held no agenda beyond simple desire for company. I'll come, Nora heard herself say, if Mrs. Patterson can spare me. I suppose I can manage one Sunday evening without my apprentice, Mrs. Patterson said dryly. Though you'll need to make up the time on Monday. Lucy launched herself at Nora in another of her impulsive hugs, nearly knocking the needle from Nora's hand. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to tell Papa right now, and he'll be so happy, even though he'll pretend he's not, because that's what grown-ups do. Pretend their feelings aren't as big as they really are. She was out the door in a whirlwind of energy, leaving silence in her wake. Mrs. Patterson set down the fabric she'd been examining and looked at Nora with an expression that was almost gentle. That child's already half in love with you, Mrs. Patterson said, and the father's not far behind, though he doesn't know it yet. Be careful with them, Nora. They've been broken enough. The warning carried no judgment, just concern. Nora nodded, understanding the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. Lucy and Evan Hale had already been abandoned once. If Nora let them get close and then left, or worse, was forced to leave, the damage would cut deeper than any rejection Nora herself had endured. But maybe that was the risk of connection. Maybe caring for people meant accepting the possibility of hurting them, of being hurt, of everything falling apart despite your best intentions. Maybe that was what made it worthwhile. Sunday arrived with a kind of crystalline clarity that made the Wyoming landscape look like it had been cut from glass. Nora stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting her mother's green dress for the third time, her hands unsteady with a nervousness she couldn't quite justify. It was just supper, just a meal with a lonely widower and his talkative daughter. Nothing to warrant the flutter in her chest or the way her pulse jumped at every sound from the street below. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway without knocking, as was her habit. You look fine. Stop fussing. The man's seen you covered in thread lint and squinting at seams for a week straight. I doubt a dress is going to change his opinion one way or another. I'm not trying to change anyone's opinion, Nora said, but her hand smoothed the fabric again anyway. Of course not. Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she believed otherwise. The Hale place is about a mile west of town. Follow the creek road until you see a white fence. Can't miss it. Be back before full dark. That road's not safe at night. Too many ruts and no moon tonight. Nora nodded, pulling on her threadbare shawl. It wasn't adequate for the cold, but it was all she had. Mrs. Patterson sighed and disappeared, returning moments later with a heavy wool cloak. Take this. It's old, but it's warm, and I won't have you freezing on my account. Call it part of your wages if it makes you feel better about accepting it. The cloak was forest green, well made despite its age, and lined with flannel that still held warmth from wherever Mrs. Patterson had stored it. Nora wrapped it around her shoulders and felt immediately safer, as if the garment could protect her from more than just cold. Thank you, she said quietly. Just don't track mud on it. And Nora? Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to something almost soft. That family needs someone. Don't let fear talk you out of being that someone, if it comes to it. The words followed Nora out into the November afternoon. The creek road wound through prairie grass gone gold with approaching winter, past homesteads marked by thin columns of chimney smoke. Cattle dotted distant hills, and overhead a hawk circled on thermal currents, patient and watchful. The landscape held a stark beauty that Nora was only beginning to appreciate. Not gentle like Missouri, not dramatic like Colorado, but honest in its severity. The Hale homestead announced itself with the white fence Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, weathered but sturdy, enclosing a modest house with a peaked roof and a wide porch. Chickens scratched in a yard beside a barn that had seen better days, and a vegetable garden lay dormant, waiting for spring. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the window Nora could see the warm glow of lamplight. Before she could knock, the door flew open and Lucy launched herself down the porch steps. You came. Papa said you would. But I was worried you might change your mind, or get lost, or decide you didn't want to come after all. But you're here. Lucy grabbed Nora's hand with both of hers. Come inside. It's freezing, and Mrs. Chen brought a whole chicken and potatoes, and Papa actually cleaned the house, which took forever, because he kept getting distracted by things that needed fixing, and I had to remind him that guests don't care if the door hinge squeaks. Lucy, let Miss Whitman get through the door before you talk her ear off, Evan called from inside, but his voice held affection rather than censure. The interior of the house was simple but well kept, with furniture that was practical rather than decorative. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, crackling with a fire that made the whole space warm. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, making Nora's mouth water despite her nervousness. Evan stood near the table wearing clean clothes and an expression that hovered between pleased and anxious. Thank you for coming, he said, wiping his hands on a towel. I hope Lucy didn't pester you too much this week. She brightened every afternoon, Nora said honestly. I looked forward to her visits. Lucy beamed at this, tugging Nora toward a chair. Sit here, next to me. Papa sits at the head because he's the papa, and I sit here because I like being close to the fire. And you can sit between us, and we can talk and eat. And, Papa, can we eat now? I'm starving, and Miss Nora must be hungry too because it's a long walk from town, and walking makes you hungry, doesn't it, Miss Nora? Breathe, sweetheart. Evan caught his daughter's shoulder gently. Let's say grace first. Nora tensed, preparing for the familiar prayer ritual that would remind her she didn't quite belong. But Evan's grace was brief and simple, thanking the land and the food and the company, words that felt more like gratitude than obligation. When he finished, Lucy immediately started chattering again, her fork already moving toward the chicken. The meal was better than good. Mrs. Chen had clearly taken pity on Evan's culinary limitations and provided a feast. Roasted chicken with herbs, potatoes mashed with butter and cream, carrots glazed with honey, fresh bread that was still warm. Lucy maintained a steady stream of conversation, filling any silence before it could become awkward. Miss Pruitt says I need to practice my handwriting, but I think my handwriting is fine. Don't you think it's fine, Miss Nora? And Papa says I need to practice sitting still. But sitting still is boring when there's so much to do and see and... Papa, can I show Miss Nora the creek after supper? Please? It's really pretty and the willows are turning yellow and... After supper and after dishes, Evan said. And only if Miss Whitman wants to see it. I'd love to, Nora found herself saying, and Lucy's face lit up like sunrise. Watching them together, Lucy's animated chatter and Evan's patient responses, the way he automatically cut her meat into smaller pieces, the way she leaned against him unconsciously. Nora felt something twist in her chest. This was what family looked like. Not perfect, not without its worn edges and tired moments, but real, connected. The kind of belonging that wasn't about blood, but about choice, about showing up day after day and choosing each other again. Lucy tells me you're learning fast at the dress shop, Evan said, dragging Nora from her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson doesn't give praise easily. She hasn't actually praised me, Nora admitted, but she's stopped sighing quite so heavily when she looks at my work, which I'm interpreting as progress. Evan smiled, and the expression transformed his tired face into something almost young. That's high praise from Agnes Patterson. She once told me my fence posts were adequate, and I built a barn on the strength of that compliment. You built the barn yourself? Nora looked at the structure visible through the window with new appreciation. Had help from neighbors, but yes, it's not fancy, but it keeps the animals dry. He paused, studying his plate. I'm a carpenter by trade. Or I was back in Kansas. Here I do whatever work comes, building, repairs, some farming when the land cooperates. It's not what I planned, but then nothing turned out quite like I planned. The words carried weight that had nothing to do with carpentry or farming. Lucy, sensing the shift in her father's mood, pressed closer to him. Mama's in heaven, she announced matter-of-factly. She got sick and the doctors couldn't fix her. And then she went to heaven and Papa says she watches over us, but I can't see her, which makes it hard to know if she's really there. But Papa says faith means believing even when you can't see, and I'm trying to have faith, but it's confusing sometimes. Silence fell over the table, heavy and complicated. Evan's hand found Lucy's hair, stroking it with unconscious gentleness. His eyes held a grief so deep it seemed bottomless, the kind that time could soften but never fully erase. I'm sorry, Nora said quietly. Loss like that leaves holes that nothing can fill. You sound like you know something about it, Evan said, his eyes meeting hers. My mother died when I was 8. Fever, like your wife. My father couldn't handle it, couldn't handle me. I've been filling in the holes ever since, though I'm not sure they ever really close. Lucy reached across the table and took Nora's hand, her small fingers warm and surprisingly strong. We can have holes together, she said seriously. Maybe if we put our holes next to each other, they won't feel so empty. The simple logic of it, the profound wisdom in a child's attempt to make sense of loss, made Nora's throat tight. She squeezed Lucy's hand gently, not trusting her voice. Evan cleared his throat roughly. Well, on that philosophical note, who wants to help with dishes before we lose the light? They worked together in easy coordination, Evan washing while Lucy dried, and Nora put things away in cupboards Lucy pointed out. It was domestic and ordinary, and somehow more intimate than any grand gesture could have been. This was real life, Nora thought, not the romance novels she'd read in stolen moments, not the promises in mail-order advertisements. Just people moving through their days, finding ways to survive and occasionally thrive. After dishes, Lucy dragged them both outside to see the creek, running ahead with the boundless energy of childhood while Evan and Nora followed at a more measured pace. The afternoon sun slanted gold across the prairie, catching in the willow branches Lucy had mentioned, turning them luminous. She's taken with you, Evan said quietly. In all the time we've been here, she hasn't connected with anyone like this. Most people see her energy as a problem to be managed, rather than a gift to be appreciated. She's remarkable, Nora said simply. Honest in a way most people forget how to be. The world tries to teach us to hide what we feel, but Lucy hasn't learned that lesson yet. I hope she never does. I worry I'm failing her. The confession came out rough, like it had been held back too long. She needs a mother, needs someone who can teach her the things a father can't. How to braid her hair properly, how to navigate the social rules that govern women's lives. I'm doing my best, but my best feels inadequate most days. You're keeping her alive and loved and curious about the world, Nora said firmly. That's not inadequate. That's everything. They reached the creek where Lucy was already pulling off her boots, preparing to wade despite the cold water. Evan called out a warning about not going too deep. And Lucy rolled her eyes with the dramatic flair only children could muster. I know, Papa, I'm not a baby. You're my baby, Evan countered. You'll be my baby when you're 40. That's impossible. When I'm 40, you'll be… Lucy paused, working through the math. Really old. Like ancient, like maybe dead. Thank you for that cheerful thought, sweetheart. Nora laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine pleasure. When was the last time she'd laughed like this, easy and unguarded? The missionary school had trained laughter out of her, and the years of rejection had finished the job. But here, watching Lucy splash in the creek, while Evan pretended to be offended by her assessment of his future age, laughter felt natural again. They stayed by the creek until the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Lucy chattered about school and her friend Sarah, whose father ran the general store, and how she wanted a dog. But Papa said maybe next year, when they were more settled, and did miss Nora like dogs, because if she did, maybe she could help convince Papa that this year was really the same as next year, just sooner. On the walk back to the house, Lucy's energy finally began to flag. She yawned widely, stumbling slightly, and Evan scooped her up without breaking stride. She nestled against his shoulder, her eyes already drooping. Tired, sweetheart? Evan's voice was soft. No, Lucy mumbled, even as she yawned again. Just resting my eyes. By the time they reached the house, she was fully asleep, her breathing deep and even. Evan carried her inside, and Nora watched as he gently removed her boots, finally on the correct feet, and tucked her into a small bed in a room off the main living area. He brushed hair back from her forehead with infinite tenderness, adjusted the quilt around her shoulders, and stood watching her sleep for a long moment before returning to where Nora waited. She'll be out until morning, he said quietly. Once she crashes, nothing wakes her. I've carried her through thunderstorms without her stirring. She's lucky to have you, Nora said. I'm lucky to have her. She's the only reason I kept breathing after Mary died. When everything felt pointless, Lucy needed breakfast, needed stories, needed someone to tell her the world was still good, even though it had just proven otherwise. He moved to the fireplace, adding another log. I should let you get back to town before full dark. The road's not safe once the light goes. Nora nodded, but neither of them moved. The fire crackled between them, and outside the last light was fading from purple to black. The moment stretched, waited with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Thank you for coming today, Evan said finally. It meant more than you probably realize, to both of us. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a long time since I've felt… Nora paused, searching for the right word. Welcome. Like my presence was wanted rather than tolerated. You're wanted here, Evan said, and the simple directness of it made Nora's breath catch. I know we're not much, a broken family in a half-finished house, but you're wanted here. Lucy's not the only one who's been hoping you'd stay. Before Nora could respond, before she could process what he might mean by that, a sound from Lucy's room made them both freeze. Not her usual sleep sounds, but something else. A cough, wet and harsh, followed by a whimper. Evan was moving before the sound fully registered, crossing to Lucy's room in 3 strides. Nora followed, her heart suddenly racing with undefined dread. Lucy lay twisted in her blankets, her face flushed in the lamplight. As they watched, she coughed again, her small body convulsing with the force of it. Evan's hand went to her forehead, and Nora saw his expression change, fear flooding in to replace the warmth that had been there moments before. She's burning up, he said, his voice tight. She was fine an hour ago. How can she be this hot this fast? Nora moved to the bedside, her own hand confirming what Evans had found. Lucy's skin felt like fire, dry and scorching to the touch. The child's eyes fluttered open, confused and glassy. Papa? Her voice was small, frightened. I don't feel good. My throat hurts and I'm cold, but I'm hot, and everything feels wrong. Another coughing fit seized her, worse than the first. When it subsided, she whimpered, tears sliding down her feverish cheeks. It's all right, sweetheart. You're going to be all right. But Evan's hands shook as he tried to adjust her blankets, his fear palpable. I need to get the doctor. Nora, can you stay with her? I'll be as fast as I can. Wait. Nora caught his arm, her mind racing through memories of her mother, of the knowledge passed down through generations of Cherokee women who'd healed their people long before white doctors arrived. How far is the doctor? 5 miles. In the opposite direction from town. 5 miles there, 5 miles back. At least an hour, probably more in the dark. Lucy's fever was climbing by the minute. Nora could feel the heat radiating from her small body. An hour might be too long. Let me try something first, Nora said. My mother taught me some things, plants, remedies. If it doesn't work, you can still get the doctor, but we might not have time to wait. Evan's eyes searched hers, desperate and afraid. What if it makes it worse? What if... Papa? Lucy's voice was barely a whisper. Don't leave. Please don't leave. The plea broke something in Evan's face. He looked at his daughter, then at Nora, a decision forming in the space between breaths. What do you need? He asked. Nora's mind was already cataloging what she'd seen in the yard, in the landscape around the homestead. Willow bark from the creek. Yarrow if you have any growing near the house. It has small white flowers, feathery leaves. Honey if you have it. Clean cloths and cool water. And I need you to trust me. The last part was the hardest, asking a father to trust his daughter's life to a woman he barely knew, to remedies that white medicine had long dismissed as superstition. But Evan nodded once, sharp and decisive. Tell me exactly what to look for. While Evan gathered supplies, Nora stayed with Lucy, whose fever continued to climb despite Nora's attempts to cool her with damp cloths. The child drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes lucid enough to ask for water, sometimes lost in fever dreams that made her cry out for her mother. I know, sweetheart, Nora murmured, stroking Lucy's sweat-dampened hair. I know it hurts, but you're going to be all right. I promise you're going to be all right. She had no right to make that promise. No certainty that the old remedies would work, that she remembered enough of what her mother had taught her. But Lucy needed to hear it, needed something solid to hold on to while fever tried to pull her under. Evan returned with arms full. Willow branches, yarrow plants, a jar of honey, strips of clean cloth. His hands were scraped and muddy from searching in the dark, but his eyes were steady now, focused on action rather than fear. Tell me what to do, he said. Nora worked quickly, stripping bark from the willow branches, crushing yarrow leaves, mixing everything in hot water to create a bitter tea. Her hands moved with a certainty that surprised her, muscle memory waking from years of dormancy. She could almost hear her mother's voice guiding her. The willow gives up its pain-stealing medicine willingly, but you must ask with respect. The yarrow stops fever's fire, but too much, and you douse the body's natural heat entirely. Balance, daughter. Everything is balance. When the tea was ready, Nora sweetened it with honey and helped Lucy sit up enough to drink. The child fought it at first, her fever-addled mind rejecting the bitter taste, but Nora persisted with gentle firmness. I know it tastes terrible, she said, but it will help. Just a little more, Lucy. You're so brave. Just a little more. Lucy managed 3 swallows before pushing the cup away weakly. It would have to be enough. Nora laid her back down and began applying cool compresses to her forehead, her wrists, behind her knees, anywhere the blood ran close to the surface. Now what? Evan asked, hovering anxiously. Now we wait. The fever should break within an hour if the tea works. If it doesn't... Nora didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what came next. The waiting was torture. Evan paced the small room like a caged animal, while Nora maintained her vigil beside Lucy's bed, changing the compresses as they warmed, coaxing more tea into the child whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. Time seemed to stretch and contract strangely, minutes lasting hours while whole quarters of the clock face disappeared unnoticed. Lucy's fever climbed higher before it began to fall, reaching a terrifying peak where her skin felt too hot to touch and her breathing turned rapid and shallow. Nora found herself praying to spirits she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, bargaining with forces that might not exist. Let this child live. Let these remedies work. Let me be enough. Evan had stopped pacing and now sat on Lucy's other side, his hand wrapped around his daughter's small one, his lips moving in silent words that might have been prayer or plea or simply her name repeated like a talisman. Tell me about your wife, Nora said quietly, needing to fill the terrible silence with something other than Lucy's labored breathing. Tell me about Mary. Evan's eyes lifted to hers, surprised. Then he started talking, his voice low and rough with memory. She laughed at everything. That's what I remember most, her laugh. It was too loud for polite company, and she didn't care. She'd throw her head back and just let it out, this big, joyful sound that made everyone around her smile, whether they wanted to or not. He paused, his thumb rubbing circles on Lucy's hand. She was a schoolteacher when I met her. Terrified me, actually. I was just a carpenter, barely educated, and here was this woman who could recite poetry and knew Latin and played piano. But she saw something in me I didn't see in myself. She made me believe I could be more than I was. Lucy has her laugh, Nora observed, that same fearless joy. She does. Sometimes it's all that keeps me going, hearing Mary's laugh coming out of our daughter's mouth, like she left a piece of herself behind to keep us company. His voice cracked slightly. I can't lose Lucy too. I can't. It would break something in me that can't be fixed. You won't, Nora said with more confidence than she felt. Look, her breathing's slowing. That's good. It means her body's not fighting so hard. It was true. Lucy's frantic respirations were beginning to even out, becoming deeper and more regular. Nora pressed a hand to the child's forehead and felt, or desperately wanted to feel, a slight decrease in temperature. Give it a few more minutes, she murmured, afraid to hope too soon. They waited as the night deepened around them, the house silent except for the fire's crackle and Lucy's breathing. Evan had taken over the compresses, his hands gentle and precise as he cooled his daughter's fevered skin. Nora prepared more tea, ready to give Lucy another dose if needed. Then, as the clock struck 10, Lucy stirred. Her eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in hours, and she looked at her father with confusion rather than delirium. Papa? Her voice was hoarse but present. Why are you crying? Evan laughed, the sound half-sob, and gathered his daughter carefully into his arms. Because I'm so glad you're awake, sweetheart. You gave us quite a scare. I had a dream, Lucy mumbled against his shoulder. Mama was there. She said I wasn't supposed to come with her yet, that I still had things to do here. She said to tell you she's not sad anymore, and you shouldn't be either. Evan's shoulders shook with silent weeping, his face buried in his daughter's hair. Nora looked away, giving them this moment of private grief and relief, her own eyes burning with tears she wouldn't shed. The fever broke completely around midnight. Lucy's temperature dropped to something approaching normal, and she fell into genuine sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness. Nora showed Evan how to continue the compresses through the night, how to prepare more willow bark tea if the fever tried to return. I should go, she said quietly, though the thought of walking the dark road alone made her uneasy. She's past the worst of it. She'll need rest and liquids tomorrow, but she's going to be all right. Stay. Evan's voice was rough from emotion and exhaustion. Please. It's late, the road's not safe, and He paused, struggling with something. I don't want to be alone with this right now. If the fever comes back, I need you here. Lucy needs you here. Nora should have refused, should have maintained proper boundaries, avoided the implications of spending the night in a widower's home. But Lucy was still flushed with residual fever, and Evan looked like he might collapse if asked to carry any more weight alone. I'll stay, she said. I'll sleep in the chair beside her bed, in case she needs anything. Thank you. The words held more than gratitude. They held the weight of a man who'd been carrying too much for too long, who'd just watched his daughter nearly follow his wife into death, who'd been saved by a woman he barely knew but was beginning to desperately need. Nora settled into the chair while Evan checked Lucy one more time, kissing her forehead with infinite tenderness. When he finally retired to his own room, leaving both doors open so he could hear any change, Nora sat in the darkness listening to Lucy breathe. The child slept peacefully now, her fever-flushed cheeks gradually returning to normal color. Watching her, Nora felt something shift inside herself, something she'd kept carefully locked away for years. This was what it meant to matter, not to be tolerated or temporarily housed, but to be essential. Lucy's survival tonight had depended on Nora's knowledge, on memories of her mother that she'd thought were fading into uselessness. Her mother's medicine had saved this child's life. That meant something. It had to mean something. As dawn began to lighten the windows, Lucy stirred and opened her eyes. She looked at Nora without surprise, as if finding her there was the most natural thing in the world. "Did you stay all night?" Lucy's voice was barely a whisper. "I did." Because you wanted to, or because Papa made you?" "Because I wanted to. Because I needed to know you were all right." Lucy smiled, the expression weak but genuine. "I'm glad you're here, Miss Nora. I'm glad Papa brought you to our house. I think maybe Mama sent you to us, to help fill up some of those holes we talked about." Nora's throat closed with emotion. "Maybe she did, sweetheart. Maybe she did. Will you stay?" Lucy's eyes were already closing again, sleep reclaiming her. "Not just today. Always. Will you stay with us always?" The question hung in the air as Lucy drifted back to sleep, leaving Nora to sit with its impossible weight. Stay always. As if that were something she could promise. As if her staying wouldn't depend on 1,000 factors beyond her control. On whether Evan truly wanted her there. On whether the town would accept her presence. On whether she could trust herself not to run when things got difficult. But as morning light filled the room and Evan emerged from his bedroom, with hope and exhaustion warring in his expression, as Lucy slept peacefully with color returning to her cheeks, Nora felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where staying was possible, where her presence wasn't just tolerated but needed, where the holes Lucy had spoken of might actually heal if they put them close enough together. For the first time since stepping off that train in Bitter Creek, Nora let herself imagine a future that extended beyond the next week, the next month, the next inevitable rejection. She let herself imagine home. Evan looked at her across Lucy's sleeping form, and Nora saw the question in his eyes before he spoke it. "You saved her life," he said quietly, his voice still rough from the long night. "I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't know if there are even words for what I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Nora said, but the words felt insufficient for what had passed between them in those desperate hours. "I just did what needed doing." "No." Evan moved around the bed, standing close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the remnants of fear still haunting his eyes. "You did more than that. You trusted knowledge most people would have dismissed as superstition. You stayed when you could have left. You fought for her like she was—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "Like she was yours." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Yours. As if Lucy could belong to Nora, as if this family could become something she had a right to claim. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I should get back to town," Nora said, retreating from the intensity in his gaze. "Mrs. Patterson will wonder where I am, and Lucy needs rest more than she needs me hovering." "Nora." Evan caught her hand as she turned toward the door, his grip gentle but insistent. "Wait, please." She stopped but didn't turn around, couldn't face whatever she might see in his expression. Her hand in his felt like a brand, marking her with possibilities she wasn't ready to accept. "Last night, watching you with Lucy, seeing how you knew exactly what to do," Evan's voice was low, almost hesitant. "I realized something. Lucy was right when she asked if you'd stay. We need you here. Not just for medicine or help with the house. We need you because you fit in the empty spaces like you were always meant to fill them." Nora turned slowly, her hand still caught in his. "You don't know me, Evan. You don't know where I've been or what I've done. You don't know about all the places that didn't want me, all the times I've been left behind?" He supplied gently. "Rejected? Told you weren't enough?" His thumb traced a circle on her palm, the touch sending warmth up her arm. "I know enough. I know you're kind to a talkative child when most people find her exhausting. I know you work harder than anyone I've seen to learn skills that don't come naturally. I know you stayed up all night with a sick little girl who isn't yours, using knowledge your mother gave you to save a life. That's all I need to know. It's not that simple. It is that simple. Or at least it could be." Evan took a breath, and Nora saw him gather courage for whatever came next. "Stay with us. Not just for today or this week. Stay as part of this family. Marry me, Nora. Help me raise Lucy. Help me turn this house into a home again." The proposal hung in the air between them, audacious in its directness. No pretty speeches, no romantic gestures, Just a practical offer from a practical man who knew what he needed and was brave enough to ask for it. "You're asking me to marry you because I saved Lucy's life," Nora said slowly, testing the words. "That's gratitude, It's not just gratitude." Evan's grip on her hand tightened. "Maybe that's what pushed me to say it now, but I've been thinking it for days. Since that first morning when Lucy decided you were hers and dragged us into your life, whether you wanted us there or not. Since I watched you eat Mrs. Henderson's cookies and smile at my daughter like she was precious instead of exhausting. Since I realized that being around you makes the world feel less heavy." "You barely know me," Nora repeated, but her voice wavered. "I know you better than Tom Garrett did when he sent for you, and you were willing to marry him." The words held no judgment, just observation. "At least I'm asking you face to face after seeing who you really are instead of who I imagined you'd be." He had a point. She'd been ready to marry a stranger based on letters that were probably lies. Why was this different? Why did Evan's proposal feel more dangerous than answering a mail-order advertisement? Because this time she had something to lose. "I can't give you an answer right now," Nora said carefully. "This is too big, too fast. Lucy almost died last night and you're exhausted, and I'm—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of believing this could work and then having it fall apart. Of letting Lucy love me and then disappointing her. Of—" Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Of not being enough." Evan's free hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture so gentle it made her eyes burn. "You're already enough, Nora. You've been enough since the moment you walked into Mrs. Henderson's dining room, looking like the world had beaten you down, but you were determined not to stay down. That's enough. That's more than enough." Before she could respond, Lucy stirred in her bed, making a small sound. They both turned toward her, the moment breaking as parental concern overrode everything else. But when Lucy simply shifted in sleep and settled again, when Evan's hand dropped from Nora's face and their fingers unlaced, something had fundamentally changed between them. The question had been asked. Now Nora just had to decide if she was brave enough to answer yes. She left while Lucy still slept, promising to return that afternoon to check on the child's recovery. The walk back to town felt different than it had the day before. The prairie grass seemed less desolate, the distant mountains less forbidding. Or maybe it was just that she'd spent the night belonging somewhere, even temporarily, and the world looked kinder through that lens. Mrs. Patterson was waiting when Nora arrived at the shop, arms crossed and expression unreadable. "You stayed at the Hale place all night." It wasn't a question. Nora should have known that in a town this size, nothing stayed secret long. "Lucy took ill, high fever. By the time it broke, it was too late and too dangerous to walk back." "So you nursed her through it?" Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "Mary Henderson sent word this morning, said Evan came by early to let people know Lucy was sick but recovering and that you'd stayed to help. The whole town's talking about it." "Of course they are." Nora felt exhaustion settle over her like a weight. "Let me guess. They're questioning the propriety of an unmarried woman spending the night at a widower's home." "Some are. Others are saying you saved that child's life, that you used old medicine that actually worked when half the doctors in this territory would have just bled her and made things worse." Mrs. Patterson moved to the cutting table, her hands arranging fabric scraps into neat piles. "What they're really talking about is whether you're going to stay, whether Evan Hale's going to do the smart thing and ask you to marry him before someone else does." Nora's hand stilled on the cloak she'd been hanging up. "He already asked." "Did he now?" Mrs. Patterson's smile was knowing. "And what did you say?" "I said I needed time to think about it." Smart girl. Never accept a proposal on the first asking. Makes men appreciate what they're getting. Mrs. Patterson gestured toward the workbench. "Well, while you're thinking, you can help me finish Mrs. Chen's dress. Her anniversary's in 3 days, and she's counting on this being ready. Nothing like detailed seam work to clarify one's thoughts." They worked in companionable silence for a while, needles flashing in the morning light. But Nora's mind kept wandering back to Lucy's fevered face, to Evan's exhausted gratitude, to the weight of his proposal sitting heavy on her shoulders. "I'm afraid," Nora admitted finally, "of making another mistake, of thinking this time will be different and then discovering it's the same pattern, just prettier wrapping." Mrs. Patterson set down her scissors with precision. Thomas Garrett rejected you because he's a coward who cares more about what people think than about character. Those other men, Morrison and Thatcher, they made their judgments based on nothing but their own prejudices. But Evan Hale? He's asking you to marry him after seeing you at your most real, after watching you save his daughter's life, using knowledge that most white folks would dismiss as primitive nonsense. He's not asking despite who you are. He's asking because of who you are. What if I'm not good enough? What if Lucy needs more than I can give her, or Evan wakes up one day and realizes he made a mistake? Stop! Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through Nora's spiral. You listen to me, girl. I've lived 73 years on this earth, and I've learned a few things. One of them is that no one's ever good enough if you measure against perfection. We're all just broken people trying to love other broken people as best we can. The question isn't whether you're good enough. The question is whether you're brave enough to try. The words settled into Nora's chest, finding spaces she hadn't known were empty. Brave enough to try. When had she last been brave? Really brave, not just surviving brave, but choosing brave. I want to say yes, Nora whispered, but I'm so scared of hoping again. Hope's meant to be scary, Mrs. Patterson said matter-of-factly. If it wasn't, everyone would do it all the time and it wouldn't mean anything. The fact that it terrifies you means it matters. Means you've got something real to lose, which also means you've got something real to gain. A knock on the shop door interrupted them. Mrs. Henderson stood outside, basket in hand and determination in her expression. Mrs. Patterson unlocked the door and the landlady swept in like she owned the place. I've brought lunch for both of you, and don't argue. You need to eat, and I need to talk sense into this girl before she lets fear make her stupid. Mrs. Henderson set the basket on the counter and turned her sharp eyes on Nora. Evan Hale's a good man. His daughter's a treasure despite being chattier than a magpie. You've got a chance here to have what most of us spend our whole lives looking for, family that chooses you. So whatever nonsense your fear is telling you, I suggest you tell it to be quiet and listen to what your heart knows. My heart doesn't have the best track record, Nora said weakly. Your heart's been abused by people who didn't deserve it, Mrs. Henderson corrected. That's different than being wrong. Now eat this sandwich and stop acting like you don't deserve good things. Over lunch, thick sandwiches and apple pie that Mrs. Henderson claimed was left over, but Nora suspected had been made specifically for this purpose. The two older women tag-teamed Nora with wisdom, advice, and the occasional sharp observation about how stubbornness could be a virtue or a vice depending on what you were being stubborn about. I was married for 42 years, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice going soft. Lost my Thomas 5 years ago to his heart giving out. And I'd do it all again, the hard years, the fights, the times we barely had enough to eat, because being chosen by him and choosing him back was the best thing I ever did. That's what marriage is, Nora. Not perfection. Just two people choosing each other over and over until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing. Lucy's already chosen you, Mrs. Patterson added. That child decided you were hers from the first moment she saw you. And Evan's choosing you too, not because you're convenient or available, but because you're you. The only person who hasn't chosen yet is you. So the question is, are you going to keep running from belonging? Or are you finally going to stand still and let it catch you? The afternoon passed in a blur of stitching and thinking, needlework and soul work happening simultaneously. Nora's hands moved through familiar motions while her mind circled the same territory over and over, examining Evan's proposal from every angle, testing it for weaknesses, searching for the trap she'd learned to expect. But no trap revealed itself. Just an honest man asking an honest question. Would she stay? By the time Nora returned to the Hale homestead that evening, ostensibly to check on Lucy's recovery, she'd made her decision. Fear still twisted in her stomach, and doubt whispered constant warnings. But beneath both ran something stronger. Hope, stubborn and resilient as prairie grass. Lucy was sitting up in bed, weak but smiling, when Nora arrived. Miss Nora, Papa said you might not come back today, but I knew you would because you promised, and you keep your promises, don't you? I try to, Nora said, settling on the edge of the bed. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Tired and my throat still hurts, but Papa made me drink so much water I think I might turn into a fish. Lucy leaned against Nora's shoulder with the easy trust of childhood. He said you made me better with your mama's medicine. That's a good thing to know, isn't it? That your mama's still helping people even though she's gone? Nora's throat tightened. Yes, sweetheart, that's a very good thing to know. Miss Nora? Lucy's voice dropped to a whisper. Did Papa ask you to stay? Because he was going to? He told me he was going to, and I said he should because you're perfect for us and we're perfect for you, and perfect things should stay together. He asked, Nora confirmed. And? Lucy pulled back to look at her with those two old eyes. What did you say? I said I needed to think about it. Are you done thinking now? Because I think you've had enough time, and thinking too much makes your brain tired, and then you can't tell what's real and what's just scary stories you're telling yourself. Lucy's logic was unassailable. So are you done thinking? Before Nora could answer, Evan appeared in the doorway. He'd cleaned up since the morning, shaved and changed clothes, but exhaustion still lined his face. His eyes found Nora's and held, a question in them that matched his daughter's. Lucy, why don't you rest a bit more while I talk to Miss Nora? Evan said gently. Because you want to have a grown-up conversation without me listening, Lucy said with the resigned wisdom of children everywhere. Fine, but I'll be paying attention through the door, so you might as well let me stay. Lucy, I'm resting, see? Lucy lay back dramatically, closing her eyes. Completely resting and definitely not listening at all. Evan sighed, but couldn't quite hide his smile. He gestured toward the main room and Nora followed, aware of Lucy's definitely listening ears behind them. The evening light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber. Evan stood by the fireplace, his hands shoved in his pockets like he didn't know what else to do with them. I shouldn't have asked this morning, he said before Nora could speak. You'd been up all night. Lucy had almost died. I was a mess. It wasn't fair to put that on you then. But you meant it, Nora said. It wasn't a question. Every word. He turned to face her fully. I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. But Mary used to say that sometimes you just know when something's right, that your heart recognizes home even when your head's still catching up. And my heart, he stopped, took a breath. My heart recognized you the moment Lucy dragged me into Mrs. Henderson's dining room, and you looked at my daughter like she was wonderful instead of overwhelming. She is wonderful, Nora said softly. You both are. That's what makes this so terrifying. I've never had something this good offered to me. I don't know how to trust it. Then don't trust it yet. Trust me instead. Evan took a step closer. Trust that I mean what I say. Trust that when I look at you, I see exactly who you are, and I'm asking anyway. Trust that Lucy needs you, and I need you, and this family we could build together. It's real. It's not charity or gratitude or desperation. It's choice. My choice. Lucy's choice. And if you want it to be, it can be your choice too. Nora looked at him. This tired, honest man who'd already lost so much, but was brave enough to risk his heart again. She thought about Lucy in the next room, pretending to rest while hanging on every word. She thought about Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson, about the way they'd vouched for her, believed in her. She thought about her mother's medicine saving a child's life, proving that the knowledge she carried had value, that she had value. And she thought about all those train platforms, all those men who'd looked at her and walked away, all those years of believing she was the problem. Maybe they'd been right in a way. Maybe she had been wrong for them. But that didn't mean she was wrong for everyone. Maybe she was exactly right for this. Yes, Nora said, the word escaping before fear could lock it away. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll stay. The transformation in Evan's face was immediate and complete, exhaustion giving way to relief, relief blooming into joy. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, the embrace fierce and desperate and full of promises they were both making. You won't regret this, he whispered against her hair. I swear to you, Nora, you won't regret this. I know, she said, and realized she meant it. Whatever fears still lived in her chest, regret wasn't among them. A whoop from Lucy's room made them both laugh. The door flew open and Lucy emerged, all pretense of resting abandoned. I knew it. I knew you'd say yes. Papa, she said yes. Did you hear? Miss Nora's going to stay and be my mama, and we're going to be a family, and everything's going to be perfect. Not perfect, sweetheart, Evan corrected gently, though his arm stayed wrapped around Nora's waist. But good. Really, really good. Good enough is perfect enough, Lucy declared, flinging herself at both of them. Nora caught her automatically, mindful of her lingering weakness, and felt the child's arms wrap around her waist. Lucy looked up at her with a smile that could have powered the sun. Can I call you Mama, or is that too fast? Papa says I move too fast sometimes, but I think moving fast is better than moving too slow because life's short and you should grab good things when they come, right? Nora's heart clenched at the title, at the casual way Lucy offered it. Mama. A word Nora had never expected to claim, a role she'd thought forever beyond her reach. You can call me whatever feels right to you, Nora said, her voice thick. Mama's fine. Mama's perfect. Lucy squeezed tighter. Then Mama it is. Mama Nora. That sounds nice, doesn't it, Papa? It sounds perfect, Evan agreed, his eyes meeting Nora's over their daughter's head. Their daughter. The thought was still foreign, but growing more familiar by the second. They spent the evening making plans. The wedding would be simple. Neither of them wanted anything elaborate, and Nora had no family to invite anyway. Mrs. Henderson offered to host a small gathering at the boarding house after the ceremony, and Mrs. Patterson volunteered to make Nora a proper wedding dress, waving away any protests about payment. Consider it a wedding gift, Mrs. Patterson said when Nora tried to argue. Besides, I'll not have you getting married in that old green dress, no matter how well it's held up. You're starting a new life. You deserve something new to wear while doing it. The town's reaction to the engagement was mixed. Some people genuinely celebrated, happy to see Evan Hale finding happiness again and Lucy getting the mother she needed. Others whispered behind their hands about the indecency of it all, how fast it had happened, how inappropriate for a woman of Nora's mixed heritage to marry a white man, how Evan must be desperate or deluded to make such a choice. Nora heard the whispers and found, to her surprise, that they hurt less than they once would have. Maybe because she had Mrs. Patterson's fierce defense and Mrs. Henderson's unwavering support. Maybe because Lucy chattered about her new mama to anyone who'd listen, her joy infectious and uncomplicated. Or maybe because when Evan looked at her, she saw reflected back something she'd never seen before. Certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. The wedding took place 2 weeks later on a cold December morning that sparkled with frost. Nora wore a dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Patterson had constructed with more care than any of her paid commissions, the stitching so fine it was nearly invisible. Lucy stood beside her in a new dress of her own, bouncing with excitement she couldn't contain. You look like a princess, Lucy whispered as they prepared to enter the small church. Mama, you look so pretty. I think Papa might faint when he sees you. Your papa's tougher than that, Nora said, adjusting Lucy's ribbon for the third time. Maybe, but he loves you a lot, and love makes people's brains go funny. That's what Mrs. Henderson says anyway. Lucy grabbed Nora's hand. I'm really glad you're here. I'm really glad you didn't get on the train and leave when Mr. Garrett was mean. Because if you'd left, we wouldn't have found you, and then we'd still have holes, and you'd still have holes, and nobody's holes would get filled up. Nora knelt down, heedless of her new dress, and pulled Lucy into a tight embrace. I'm glad I stayed too, sweetheart. Gladder than I can say. The ceremony was brief and simple, conducted by a traveling minister who asked only the necessary questions and didn't seem bothered by Nora's heritage or the speed of the courtship. Evan's voice shook slightly when he said his vows, but his hands were steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto Nora's finger. His mother's ring, he'd told her, saved all these years for the right moment. When the minister pronounced them married, Evan kissed her gently, carefully, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Lucy cheered loud enough to make several people wince, then launched herself at them both, insisting on a family embrace that left all three of them laughing. The gathering afterward was small but warm, held in Mrs. Henderson's dining room with food contributed by half the town. Even people who'd whispered about the engagement showed up with casseroles and pies, because weddings transcended gossip and required communal celebration. Nora moved through the afternoon in a daze, accepting congratulations from people whose names she was still learning, feeling Evan's presence at her side like an anchor. Happy? He murmured during a rare quiet moment, his arm around her waist. Terrified, Nora admitted. But yes. Happy too. Good, because there's no going back now. You're stuck with us. His smile took any sting from the words. You're stuck with a chatty 7-year-old who'll talk your ear off given half a chance, and a carpenter who burns breakfast more often than not, and a drafty house that needs about 100 repairs I keep meaning to get to. I'm stuck with a family, Nora corrected softly. That's all I've ever wanted. That night, after the guests had departed, and Lucy had finally been coaxed into bed despite her insistence that she was too excited to sleep, Nora stood in the house that was now legally hers and felt the weight of it settle over her. This was home. Not temporary lodging, not a trial period, but home. The word felt foreign on her tongue, in her mind, but she was determined to learn its shape. Evan found her standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit prairie. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stood beside her, not speaking, just present. I keep expecting to wake up, Nora said quietly, to find out this was all a dream, and I'm still on that platform waiting for a man who's never going to come. It's real, Evan assured her. This house, this family, this life, it's all real. And it's yours now. Ours. He paused. I know I'm asking you to take a lot on faith. I know my proposal wasn't romantic, and our courtship was barely existent, and I can't promise everything will be easy. But I can promise I'll choose you every day. That's what marriage is, I think, just choosing each other over and over until the choosing becomes automatic. Mrs. Henderson said almost the same thing, Nora murmured, about how marriage is choosing each other until it becomes as natural as breathing. Mary Henderson's a wise woman. Evan's arm came around her shoulders. So what do you say, Mrs. Hale? Think you can handle being chosen every day? Mrs. Hale. The name still felt strange, like trying on clothes that were the right size, but not yet broken in. But Nora had learned that strange didn't mean wrong. Sometimes strange was just unfamiliar, and unfamiliar became comfortable with time and patience. I think I can, she said, as long as you can handle choosing someone who comes with a lot of history and not much else. Your history made you who you are, and who you are is exactly who we need. Evan turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I mean that, Nora. Not despite your past, but because of it. Because it taught you strength and resilience and compassion. Because it gave you knowledge that saved my daughter's life. Because it made you someone who understands what it means to be hurt and chooses kindness anyway. Tears pricked Nora's eyes, but for once they weren't tears of sorrow or frustration. They were tears of recognition, of being seen fully and accepted completely. She'd spent so long believing she had to hide parts of herself, sand down her rough edges, make herself smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold her. But Evan wasn't asking her to shrink. He was asking her to expand, to fill up all the space in this family that had been waiting for her to arrive. Thank you, she whispered, for choosing me, for seeing me, for... Her voice broke. For making me believe I deserved to be chosen. You always deserved it, Evan said firmly. Those other men were fools who couldn't see what was right in front of them, but their loss is my gain, so I can't regret their blindness too much. From her room, Lucy called out sleepily, Are you two being mushy? Because I can hear mushy voices, and Mrs. Henderson says newly married people are always mushy. They laughed, the sound breaking the seriousness of the moment. Evan went to reassure Lucy that yes, they were being appropriately mushy, and no, she didn't need to supervise. Nora stayed by the window, watching moonlight silver the frost-touched prairie, and felt something inside her finally settle. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd been searching for through 3 territories and countless rejections. The life that had been waiting for her all along in a small Wyoming town at the end of a railroad line. She was Nora Hale now, wife, mother, woman who belonged. And for the first time in her 23 years, belonging didn't feel like a borrowed coat she'd have to return. It felt like her own skin, finally comfortable, finally right, finally home. Winter settled over Wyoming territory like a blanket, cold, heavy, and unforgiving. But inside the Hale homestead, warmth bloomed despite the frost patterns on the windows and the wind that howled through gaps in the walls Evan promised to fix come spring. Nora learned the rhythms of her new life, the way she'd learned stitching at Mrs. Patterson's shop, through repetition, patience, and the understanding that mistakes were part of the process. She learned that Lucy was incapable of whispering, that Evan hummed while he worked, that the stove required coaxing on particularly cold mornings. She learned which floorboards creaked, which chickens were temperamental layers, which neighbors could be counted on for help, and which preferred to be left alone. She learned that marriage wasn't the romantic fantasy of novels, but something more substantial, a daily choice woven through mundane tasks like washing dishes and mending socks, and deciding whose turn it was to brave the cold for more firewood. "Mama, you're doing it wrong," Lucy announced one morning in January, watching Nora attempt to braid her hair. "It's supposed to be tighter, or it falls out by lunchtime, and Miss Pruitt gets that look on her face like I'm personally offensive to her sense of order." "I'm trying," Nora said, her fingers fumbling through the unfamiliar pattern. Her own hair had always hung straight and simple. Braiding had never been part of her routine. "Maybe if you held still for more than 3 seconds." "I am holding still. This is me being very still." Lucy vibrated with suppressed energy, proving the opposite. "Mrs. Chen says her daughter's hair stays perfect all day. Maybe you could ask her how she does it." "Maybe I could," Nora agreed, trying not to feel inadequate. These small domestic tasks that other women seemed to manage effortlessly felt like tests she was constantly on the verge of failing. She could save a child's life with willow bark and yarrow, but braiding hair apparently required skills beyond her reach. Evan appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day's work. "Looks fine to me." "Papa thinks everything looks fine," Lucy said with the resigned wisdom of daughters everywhere. "He once said my dress looked fine when I had it on backward." It was early. I hadn't had coffee yet. Evan dropped a kiss on Lucy's head, then one on Nora's cheek, the gestures already familiar after 6 weeks of marriage. "I'll be at the Morrison place fixing their barn door. Should be home by supper." After he left and Lucy had been dispatched to school with her crooked braid and enthusiastic waving, Nora stood in the quiet house and felt the weight of her new responsibilities settle over her shoulders. This was her life now. Not temporary, not borrowed, but genuinely hers. The thought still had power to steal her breath. She spent the morning tackling the mending pile that seemed to regenerate overnight, then started bread that would rise while she walked into town. Mrs. Patterson had asked her to help with a rush order. The banker's wife wanted a new dress for some social occasion, and Nora was grateful for the work. Not for the money, though that helped, but for the reminder that she had value beyond her domestic contributions. That her hands could create beauty as well as manage household tasks. The walk to town had become familiar. The landmarks along the creek road as known to her now as the streets of St. Louis had once been. She passed the Miller homestead where smoke already rose from the chimney, the abandoned soddy that someone had started building then left to weather in time, the stand of cottonwoods where Lucy claimed she'd once seen a fox. Bitter Creek bustled with its usual morning activity, wagons delivering supplies, women emerging from the general store with baskets, men gathered outside the saloon despite the early hour. Nora still felt the weight of watching eyes, still heard whispers cut short when she passed, but the hostility had dulled to mere curiosity. She was Evan Hale's wife now, Lucy's mother, part of the community's fabric whether everyone approved or not. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her cutting table when Nora entered the shop. "You're late." "Lucy's braid took 3 attempts," Nora admitted, hanging her cloak on the familiar hook. "I'm starting to think hair has a personal vendetta against me." Hair requires confidence. You approach it like you're afraid of it. Mrs. Patterson's assessment was characteristically blunt. "Ask Mrs. Chen to show you. She's got 5 daughters and knows every braiding trick invented. Now, Mrs. Morrison's dress. She wants it done by Friday, which gives us 4 days. It's doable if we both work on it." They fell into the comfortable rhythm of collaboration, Mrs. Patterson cutting while Nora pinned and basted. The work was soothing in its focus, requiring enough attention that Nora's mind couldn't wander into dangerous territory. She was measuring a hem when the shop door burst open and Lucy tumbled in, her carefully constructed braid now completely destroyed. "Mama, Miss Pruitt sent me to find you. There's a lady at the train station and she's crying and nobody knows what to do, and Miss Pruitt said, you'd know because you're kind and you understand about—" Lucy paused for breath. "About being alone and scared." Nora exchanged a glance with Mrs. Patterson, who nodded once. "Go, I can finish the basting." The train station platform held an all-too-familiar scene. A young woman sat on the bench where Nora had spent her first night in Bitter Creek, a worn carpetbag at her feet, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She was younger than Nora, maybe 20, with fair hair escaping from a loose bun and a dress that had seen better days. Miss Pruitt stood at an awkward distance, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to proceed. Nora knew exactly what she was seeing because she'd lived it. Another mail-order bride, another rejection, another woman left stranded with nothing but her belongings and her shattered hopes. "Miss Pruitt, why don't you take Lucy back to school?" Nora suggested gently. "I'll handle this." The schoolteacher looked relieved. Lucy, however, planted her feet stubbornly. "But I want to help. She's sad, and I'm good at helping sad people feel better." "I know you are, sweetheart, but right now, the best help is giving this lady some privacy." Nora knelt to Lucy's level. "Trust me, okay? I know what she needs." Lucy studied her mother's face, then nodded seriously. "Okay, but tell her it gets better. Tell her about how you were sad and alone and then you found us, and now you're not sad anymore. Tell her that story." "I will," Nora promised, her throat tight. After Lucy and Miss Pruitt departed, Nora approached the bench slowly, sitting down but leaving space between herself and the crying woman. For a long moment, she said nothing, just sat in companionable silence, while the woman's sobs gradually subsided into hiccuping breaths. "I'm Nora Hale," she said finally, "and I know exactly how you feel right now." The woman looked up with red-rimmed eyes, taking in Nora's appearance. The mixed heritage features that marked her as other, the simple but well-made dress, the wedding ring on her finger. "You can't possibly know. I sat on this exact bench 2 months ago," Nora interrupted gently, "waiting for a man who'd sent for me and then took one look and walked away. I spent the night here because I had nowhere else to go and about $4 to my name. I know exactly how you feel." The woman's face crumpled again. "Harold Davis, he sent for me all the way from Ohio. We exchanged letters for 6 months. He seemed so kind, so excited about my arrival. But when I got off the train," her voice broke. "He said there'd been a misunderstanding, that I wasn't what he expected. Then he just left me here." "Did he say why?" Nora already knew the answer, but asked anyway. "I think—" The woman swallowed hard. "I think it's because I'm not pretty enough. In my photograph, I was wearing my sister's good dress, and the light was kind, and I look better than I really do. I should have been honest, should have warned him, but I was so desperate to leave Ohio, and he seemed so nice, and I thought maybe if he met me in person—" She dissolved into fresh tears. Nora's heart ached with recognition. How many women did this? Lied or stretched the truth in their letters because desperation made liars of them all, because the alternative was staying where they were, alone and unwanted and slowly suffocating under the weight of limited options. "What's your name?" Nora asked. "Catherine. Catherine Wells." "Well, Catherine Wells, here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, where you'll get a room and a hot meal. Then tomorrow, we're going to figure out what comes next. But right now, you need food and rest, and to stop believing that man's rejection says anything true about your worth." Catherine looked at her with something desperate in her eyes. "I don't have much money. Maybe enough for a few nights, but then we'll figure it out. That's what people do here. We figure things out together." Nora stood and extended her hand. "Come on, Mrs. Henderson's expecting us." "She is?" "She will be by the time we get there." Nora smiled. "Trust me, I've learned that this town has more kindness in it than you'd expect. You just have to know where to look." Mrs. Henderson took one look at Catherine's tear-stained face and Nora's determined expression and ushered them both inside without questions. Within minutes, Catherine had a room, a basin of warm water to wash with, and a promise of hot stew within the hour. "This is what you did for me," Nora said quietly to Mrs. Henderson while Catherine was upstairs washing up. "When I had nothing and nowhere to go, you gave me a chance. And you're passing it on just like I told you to." Mrs. Henderson's expression was satisfied. "That's how it works. Kindness spreading outward like ripples on a pond. Now, what's the plan for this girl? She can't stay here forever on charity." "I don't know yet, but we'll figure something out." Nora paused. "Maybe Mrs. Patterson needs more help at the shop? Or someone needs a house girl. Catherine seems educated. Maybe she could help Miss Pruitt at the school." Or maybe, Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully, she could work here. I've been thinking about hiring someone to help with cooking and cleaning now that my knees are getting cranky. Room and board plus a small wage. Nothing fancy, but enough to survive on while she figures out what's next. Relief flooded through Nora. You do that? Why not? Girl needs work. I need help. Besides, you turned out all right, and you started in worse shape than she is. Mrs. Henderson patted Nora's shoulder. Go on home to your family. I'll get Catherine settled, and we'll talk details tomorrow. Walking back to the homestead through the lengthening afternoon shadows, Nora felt something shift inside her chest. She'd helped someone. Not with medicine or sewing or any practical skill, but simply by being there, by remembering what it felt like to be abandoned and choosing to make sure Catherine didn't feel quite so alone. This was what Mrs. Patterson had meant about choosing to be the person others needed. This was what Lucy had intuited about holes filling up when you put them close together. This was the beginning of something Nora hadn't known she was building, a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do for others. Evan was already home when she arrived, working on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. He looked up at her approach, his face breaking into a smile that still had power to make her heart skip. "How was your day, Sim?" he called, setting down his tools. "I helped someone," Nora said, and proceeded to tell him about Catherine while they walked toward the house together. His arm came around her shoulders as she talked, his presence solid and reassuring. "That's good of you," Evan said when she finished. "That's the Nora I married, the one who sees people hurting and can't help but try to ease it." "I just remembered what it felt like," Nora said quietly. "Being in her position. If people hadn't helped me, Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Patterson, you and Lucy, I don't know what would have become of me. You'd have survived. You're a survivor, Nora. That's one of the things I love about you." He paused, then added softly, "One of many things." The word love still startled her when he used it. They'd married so quickly, circumstances pushing them together before deep feelings had time to develop. But Evan had started saying it a few weeks ago, casual as commenting on the weather, and each time the words settled a little deeper into Nora's understanding of what they were building. She wasn't sure she loved him yet, wasn't sure she remembered what love was supposed to feel like, but she knew she was grateful for him, valued him, chose him daily. Maybe that was what love looked like when you'd been broken too many times to trust grand emotions. Maybe love was just choosing someone consistently enough that the choosing became its own form of devotion. That evening, after Lucy had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed with a story about a brave princess who saved herself, Nora and Evan sat by the fire with the day's quiet settling around them. These were Nora's favorite moments, not the dramatic declarations or significant conversations, but simply existing together in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Evan said, breaking the quiet, "about expanding the house come spring, adding another bedroom, maybe a proper workroom where you could do sewing if you wanted to take on more work from Mrs. Patterson. Lucy's getting bigger, needs more space. And if—" He paused, his ears reddening slightly. "If our family grows, we'll need the room." The implication hung in the air between them. More children, a family expanding beyond just the three of them. The thought terrified and thrilled Nora in equal measure. She'd only just begun to believe she could be Lucy's mother. The idea of other children, babies who would be hers and Evan's from the beginning, felt impossibly enormous. "That's a lot of work," she said carefully, "and expensive. I've been saving, and I can do most of the labor myself, just need help with the heavy lifting." Evan's hand found hers in the firelight. "I'm not saying it has to happen right away, just that I'm thinking about the future. Our future. All the years ahead of us." Years ahead. The phrase that had once meant nothing but more rejection, more temporary lodging, more moving on before anyone could force her out. Now it meant something different, roots growing deeper, a foundation being built, a life that extended beyond mere survival. "I'd like that," Nora said quietly. "The expansion, the future, all of it." His smile was answer enough, and when he kissed her, it tasted like promise. The winter months passed in a blur of small moments that accumulated into something significant. Catherine Wells settled into her position at the boarding house, and gradually began to heal from her rejection, her smiles coming more easily as weeks passed. She and Nora developed a quiet friendship built on shared understanding, both women who'd been left behind and both determined not to let that define them forever. Lucy continued to grow at an alarming rate, her dresses constantly needing to be let down, her questions becoming more complex and harder to answer. She'd started calling Nora Mama without any qualifier, the title as natural as breathing now.
"Mama, where do babies come from?"
Lucy asked one morning over breakfast, the question delivered with her characteristic lack of warning. Nora choked on her coffee while Evan suddenly became very interested in his eggs. That's a complicated question, sweetheart. Mrs. Henderson says they're delivered by storks, but that doesn't make sense because storks can't carry something that heavy, and also we don't have many storks in Wyoming. Lucy's logic was, as always, unassailable. So where do they really come from? They come from love, Nora said finally, grasping for an answer that was true but not mortifying. When two people love each other very much, sometimes a baby is created from that love. But how does the love turn into a baby? That seems like magic. Lucy was not going to let this go easily. It is kind of magic, Evan interjected, rescuing Nora from having to elaborate. The most important kind, and when you're older, we'll explain the details. But for now, just know that babies are precious and wanted and made from love. Lucy accepted this with her usual equanimity. Are you and Mama going to make a baby from love? Because I'd like a sister. Or a brother would be okay too, but a sister would be better for sharing things with. Nora and Evan exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both of them fighting smiles. Maybe someday, Nora said. We'll see what happens. That's what grown-ups say when they mean yes, but don't want to admit it yet, Lucy announced. I'm going to start planning sibling activities right now. As winter gradually loosened its grip and early spring began to hint at arrival, Nora realized she'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped expecting Evan to wake up one morning and regret his choice, stopped bracing for the moment when Lucy would realize Nora wasn't a real mother and reject her accordingly, stopped assuming this happiness was temporary, on loan, something that would be reclaimed when its true owner showed up. This was her life. These were her people. This was home, permanently and without conditions. The realization came one morning in March when she was kneading bread and watching through the window as Evan taught Lucy how to plane a piece of wood, both of them laughing at something Lucy had said. The scene was so ordinary, so perfectly mundane, that it made Nora's chest ache. This was what she'd been searching for through all those rejections and relocations. Not rescue or romance, but simply the right to exist in someone's space without constantly proving her worth. Mrs. Patterson found her crying over the bread dough later that morning when Nora went into town for thread. What's wrong? The older woman demanded, setting down her scissors with concern. Nothing's wrong, Nora said, wiping her eyes. Everything's right. That's why I'm crying, because I keep waiting for it to fall apart, and it just keeps being right. And I don't know how to hold all this happiness without breaking. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. That's the risk of letting yourself belong, girl. Once you open yourself up to joy, you also open yourself up to the fear of losing it. But the alternative is staying closed off forever, and that's not living, that's just existing. I'm so afraid, Nora admitted, of failing them, of not being enough, of being human? Mrs. Patterson interrupted. Join the rest of us. We're all afraid of failing the people we love. That's what love is. Giving someone the power to hurt you and trusting them not to. Terrifying business, but worth it. The words settled into Nora's chest alongside the fear, not erasing it but contextualizing it. Everyone was afraid. Everyone doubted. The difference was that some people let fear paralyze them, while others felt the fear and chose courage anyway. Nora was learning to be the second kind of person. In early April, when the prairie grass was just beginning to green and Lucy's 8th birthday was approaching, Catherine Wells appeared at the Hale homestead with news. She'd met someone, the widowed owner of the general store who'd lost his wife years ago and had 3 children in need of a mother. He'd been courting Catherine quietly for weeks, and now he'd proposed. I wanted to tell you first, Catherine said, her hands twisting nervously in her skirts, because you're the reason I stayed. The reason I didn't just buy a ticket back to Ohio and give up on everything. You showed me that being rejected once didn't mean I wasn't worthy of being chosen eventually. Nora embraced her, this young woman who'd sat broken on a train platform and had found the strength to try again. I'm so happy for you, so proud of you. I want you at the wedding, Catherine said. You and your family. You're the closest thing I have to family here, and I want you there to see that happy endings are possible, even for women like us. Women like us. The phrase carried weight. Women who'd been rejected, abandoned, left behind. Women who'd been told they weren't enough and had chosen to believe something different. Women who'd rebuilt themselves from scraps and determination and the kindness of strangers who became friends. The wedding was small but joyful, held in the same church where Nora and Evan had married months before. Watching Catherine exchange vows with her new husband, seeing her face glow with happiness and hope, Nora felt something complete itself inside her. This was the circle Mrs. Henderson had talked about, kindness received, then passed along, then witnessed flowering into new life. At the reception afterward, Mrs. Henderson pulled Nora aside. You did good, girl. That's twice now you've helped someone find their way. People are starting to notice. But notice what? That you're someone who sees people hurting and actually does something about it. That you've got knowledge about healing that most folks around here lack. That you're building something important. Mrs. Henderson paused. There's been talk about you helping other women who show up alone and afraid, making it more formal, more organized. What do you think about that? The idea was overwhelming and exactly right. I think I'd like that, Nora said slowly. I think I'd like to be the person I needed when I first arrived, to help other women find their footing the way you and Mrs. Patterson helped me. Good. We'll talk more about it, but not today. Today's for celebrating. As spring bloomed into early summer, Nora's informal network of help began to take shape. When another abandoned mail-order bride appeared at the station in May, Nora was there within hours, offering the same assistance she'd given Catherine. The woman, Sarah Miller, ended up working at Mrs. Patterson's shop and eventually married a rancher from outside town. In June, a young widow with 2 small children arrived seeking work, fleeing from in-laws who'd tried to take her children away. Nora helped her find lodging and connected her with families who needed help with childcare. Within a month, the woman had steady income and a support network. By July, word had spread beyond Bitter Creek. Women arrived knowing that this was a place where they might find help, where being alone and desperate wasn't automatically a death sentence. Some stayed, some moved on, but all left with more than they'd arrived with: resources, connections, hope. Evan watched his wife's work with quiet pride, never complaining when strangers appeared at their door seeking Nora's help, never questioning when she used their resources to assist others. If anything, he supported her completely, building extra shelves to store the herbs and remedies Nora gathered, helping displaced women with carpentry work they couldn't afford to hire out. You're building something important, he told her one evening as they sat on their porch watching sunset paint the prairie golden rose. Lucy was inside, supposedly practicing her reading, but more likely playing with the barn cat she'd smuggled into the house. You're giving women what you needed, a chance, a safe place to land. I'm just remembering what it felt like, Nora said, and choosing to make sure others don't have to feel that way alone. That's what makes it important. Evan's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. You could have let what happened to you make you bitter. Instead, you let it make you kind. That takes strength most people don't have. In August, Lucy's long-expressed wish for a sibling became reality when Nora discovered she was pregnant. The news filled the house with excitement. Lucy immediately began planning everything from names to where the baby would sleep to which toys she'd share and which were still exclusively hers. I'm going to be the best big sister, Lucy declared. I'll teach the baby everything, how to catch frogs and climb trees, and which berries are safe to eat, and which will make you sick. And I'll protect them from mean people who say unkind things because of how we look or who our family is. The fierce protectiveness in Lucy's voice made Nora's eyes burn. This child, who'd been so wounded by loss, had somehow maintained her capacity for love and defense of those she cared for. She'd welcomed Nora without reservation and was already prepared to welcome a new sibling the same way. You're already the best big sister, Nora assured her. "This baby's going to be so lucky to have you." The pregnancy was easier than Nora had expected, though the fatigue in the first months was profound. Her body was creating life while her hands continued their work, sewing, healing, helping. Mrs. Patterson insisted she rest more, and Evan hovered with well-meaning concern that sometimes drove Nora to distraction. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him after he tried to stop her from carrying in firewood. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I'm fine." "I know, I just—" Evan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I couldn't protect Mary, couldn't keep her safe when she got sick. So now when you're vulnerable, every instinct tells me to wrap you in cotton and not let anything bad touch you." The confession broke Nora's exasperation. She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. "I'm not Mary, and this isn't the same situation. I'm healthy, the baby's healthy, and I need you to trust that I know my body well enough to ask for help if I need it. I know, I'm trying, it's just—" His hands covered hers. "I love you, Nora. I don't think I've said that enough, but I do. I love you and Lucy and this baby we're bringing into the world, and the idea of losing any of you terrifies me." "I love you too," Nora said, and realized as the words left her mouth that they were true. Not the desperate, clinging love of romance novels, but something steadier and more sustainable. Love built on choosing each other daily, on shared work and mutual respect, and the 1,000 tiny kindnesses that made a life together. "And you're not going to lose me. I'm too stubborn to go anywhere." As autumn arrived and Nora's pregnancy became more visible, the house expansion Evan had planned in winter became reality. With help from neighbors, he added 2 new rooms, a bedroom and the workroom he'd promised. The work was slow and sometimes frustrating, but by October the addition was complete. "This is yours," Evan told Nora, showing her the workroom with shy pride. "For your sewing, for preparing medicines, for meeting with women who need help. Your own space where you can do your work." The room had windows on 2 sides letting in abundant light, shelves Evan had built for storage, a work table that was exactly the right height. It was more than Nora had ever imagined having, a space specifically designed for her needs, her work, her purpose. "It's perfect," she whispered, her hands resting on her swelling belly. "Thank you." Winter came again, Nora's second in Bitter Creek, and this time she greeted it with confidence instead of fear. The house was warm, the pantry well-stocked, the family healthy. Lucy turned 8 with a party that half the town attended, her joy infectious as always. Catherine and Sarah both visited regularly, bringing their new families, building connections that strengthened the community's fabric. And on a frigid January morning with snow falling soft outside the windows, Nora gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and difficult, but when it ended, she held in her arms a tiny, perfect human with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into something between Nora's brown and Evan's hazel. "What should we name her?" Evan asked, his voice rough with emotion as he looked at his new daughter. Nora thought of her mother, of the knowledge passed down through generations that had saved Lucy's life, and now this child's by ensuring Nora knew how to support her own body through labor. She thought of new beginnings and hope renewed, and the way this tiny person represented everything Nora had thought impossible. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Lucy, allowed into the room, now that the difficult part was over, peered at her new sister with fascination. "She's so small and red and kind of wrinkly." Then in a whisper to Nora, "But she's also perfect. Can I hold her?" Watching Lucy cradle her baby sister with exaggerated care, listening to her whisper promises about all the things they'd do together, Nora felt the last piece of something inside her finally click into place. This was her family, chosen and biological, blood and something deeper than blood. This was the life she'd built from nothing but determination and the kindness of strangers who'd become friends, who'd become family. Spring came again, hope grew from wrinkly newborn to smiling infant, and Bitter Creek continued its rhythms. More women arrived seeking help, and Nora's network expanded to include not just immediate assistance, but longer-term support, helping women find work, connecting them with resources, teaching them skills that could provide independence. By the time Hope was 6 months old and Lucy was proudly introducing her baby sister to anyone who'd listen, Nora's reputation had spread beyond Wyoming territory. Letters arrived from women asking if it was true that Bitter Creek was a place where abandoned women could find help. The postmaster started setting aside space for these inquiries, and Nora found herself spending evenings drafting careful responses, offering what guidance she could from a distance. "You're becoming famous," Mrs. Patterson observed one afternoon as Nora sorted through another stack of letters in the shop. "Women across 3 territories know your name now." "That's terrifying," Nora admitted. "What if I can't help them all? What if I fail someone who's counting on me?" "Then you fail, and you keep trying anyway. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying despite the failures." Mrs. Patterson's expression was understanding. "You can't save everyone, Nora, but the ones you do save, they'll pay it forward, just like you did. That's how change happens, one saved woman at a time." On a warm day in June, Nora stood on the train platform where her story in Bitter Creek had begun. But this time, she wasn't the one waiting anxiously for someone who might not come. She was the one doing the greeting, meeting another abandoned bride named Margaret, who'd arrived with nothing but her carpetbag and her terror. "I'm Nora Hale," she said, extending her hand to the frightened young woman. "And I know exactly how you feel right now, but I also know it gets better. Will you let me help you?" Margaret's hand trembled as it met Nora's, but her nod was firm. "Please." Walking back toward town with Margaret beside her, Nora felt the circle complete itself once more. She was the help she'd needed. She was the hope she'd almost lost. She was proof that being left behind could be the beginning of finding yourself. Behind them, the train pulled out of the station with a blast of its whistle, carrying away possibilities that would never be realized. But ahead of them, Bitter Creek waited with its imperfect welcome, its rough-edged kindness, its capacity to make space for those who'd run out of spaces. At home, Evan would be making supper with Lucy's help, something that would probably be slightly burned but made with love. Hope would be napping in her cradle, growing bigger every day. And Nora's workroom would be ready for tomorrow's tasks, herbs to prepare, letters to answer, plans to make for helping the next woman who arrived alone and afraid. This was Nora's life now, not the life she'd imagined when she'd answered that first mail-order advertisement, not the fairy tale ending of romance novels. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was built on a foundation of choosing and being chosen, of helping and being helped, of failing and trying again, until the trying itself became a form of success. She'd come to Bitter Creek expecting marriage, and had found family instead, had come expecting to be chosen, and had learned to choose herself, had come looking for home, and had discovered that home wasn't a place but a practice, the daily act of showing up, staying present, choosing love, even when fear whispered that it wasn't safe. Years would pass. Lucy would grow up strong and outspoken, eventually becoming a teacher who refused to let any child feel lesser because of who they were. Hope would inherit her mother's healing knowledge and her father's practical skills, becoming the closest thing Bitter Creek had to a doctor. More women would arrive seeking help, and Nora's network would expand into something larger than she'd ever imagined, a formal organization that helped displaced women across the Western Territories. But on this June day, walking back to town with Margaret beside her and her family waiting at home, Nora felt complete. Not because her work was finished, it would never be finished, but because she'd finally become the person she was always meant to be. The woman no one wanted had become the woman everyone needed. And in becoming essential to others, she'd finally become essential to herself. That was enough. That was everything. That was home.